My mother-in-law spent the entire Mother's Day gala praising her other daughter-in-law for the $150,000 event I paid for. When I finally decided I had enough and spoke up, my husband slapped me across the face in front of 300 of Atlanta's most elite guests. The entire ballroom went dead silent. Instead of crying, I wiped my face, pulled out my phone, and whispered to my mother that it was time to end them. 1 hour later, his entire family legacy was completely erased. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who tried to dim your light. I am Camille. I am 35 years old, and for the last 5 years, I have been married to a man who saw me as nothing more than an ATM masked as a wife. I stood at the edge of the grand ballroom of the most exclusive country club in Atlanta, Georgia. The crystal chandeliers above cast a warm, golden glow over the 300 guests who had gathered for the spectacular Mother's Day gala. The room smelled of expensive orchids and roasted prime rib. Waiters in crisp white jackets floated through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne. I paid for all of it. Every single drop of champagne, every exotic flower arrangement, every hour this magnificent venue was rented came directly from my bank account. I work as a corporate financial auditor. I deal in hard numbers, undeniable facts, and absolute truths. But the Sterling family dealt entirely in illusions. The sharp, high-pitched clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute sliced through the low hum of jazz music and wealthy chatter. My mother-in-law Vivian stood at the front of the room on a small raised stage. She wore a stunning emerald green silk gown that I had purchased for her just 3 days ago. Her hair was perfectly styled and her posture was rigidly elegant. She commanded the room the way she always did, demanding attention and expecting absolute worship. Beside her stood my husband, Julian. He was the chief executive officer of his family luxury real estate firm, the Sterling Group. He looked incredibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his teeth flashing in a perfect practiced smile. And right next to Julian stood Harper. Harper was married to Julian's younger brother, Terrence. She was white blonde and possessed a syrupy sweet southern charm that she weaponized on a daily basis. In Vivian's eyes, Harper was the golden daughter-in-law. Harper came from a family with a recognizable historical name and a trust fund that nobody knew was actually drying up. I, on the other hand, was just the girl from the south side of town who clawed her way up the corporate ladder. I was the one who quietly funded the Sterling family lifestyle when their real estate deals went sideways, but I was never considered true family. Vivian smiled out at the sea of mayors, city council members, and wealthy investors. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight to celebrate family," she announced, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system I had rented. As a mother, my greatest joy is seeing the legacy of the Sterling family continue to thrive through my sons and the incredible women they brought into our lives. But tonight, I want to take a special moment to recognize the woman who made this breathtaking evening possible. Vivian turned her body directly toward Harper and placed a hand over her heart. My beautiful daughter-in-law Harper worked tirelessly for months to organize this gala. She single-handedly curated this menu, selected these gorgeous floral arrangements, and ensured that tonight would be a reflection of the elegance our family stands for. Harper, we are so blessed to have you. Blessed to have. The ballroom erupted into applause. 300 people clapped for Harper, who dramatically pressed her hands to her cheeks and feigned a look of overwhelming humility. "Oh, Vivian, you are too sweet," Harper cooed, leaning in to hug my mother-in-law. "It was my absolute pleasure because family means everything to me." I stood near the back doors, hidden in the shadows of a towering floral arrangement, gripping a small black clutch. Inside that clutch were the receipts. The catering bill for $40,000 paid by my card. The venue deposit for $50,000 paid by my card. The invoice for the string quartet, the valet service, the custom invitations, all bearing my name and my signature. Just last week, Julian had come to me pacing our living room floor. His hands were shaking as he explained that his mother had promised to host the annual spring gala, but the family trust account was overdrawn. He begged me to cover the costs just this once. He promised that Vivian would finally embrace me, that she would stand on that stage and declare her gratitude for my generosity in front of everyone. He swore that this was the key to finally being accepted. I had transferred the funds the next morning. $150,000 of my own stock options liquidated to save a woman who would not even let me sit next to her at Thanksgiving dinner. Vivian had a habit of treating me like the hired help. During the holidays, she would hand me her coat the moment I walked through the door and point me toward the closet before turning her back to greet Harper with a warm embrace. She frequently told her friends within my earshot that Julian could have married a politician's daughter, but chose a charity project instead. My mother Renee raised me better than to cause a scene. My mother taught me the value of hard work, of education, and of building my own financial independence. She had always warned me about people who wore their wealth on the outside while their bank accounts were empty. The Sterlings were exactly the kind of people my mother despised. They drove leased luxury cars, they lived in a heavily mortgaged mansion, and they spent every waking moment terrified that someone would discover they were drowning in debt. And yet they looked down on me. I poured my hard-earned wealth into a bottomless pit of their arrogance just to keep the peace. I looked at Julian, expecting him to step forward. I expected my husband of 5 years to take the microphone and correct his mother. I waited for him to say that actually his wife Camille had funded and planned the entire evening. But Julian just stood there clapping louder than anyone else, beaming with pride, as Harper soaked up the applause that rightfully belonged to me. He made eye contact with me from across the room. He saw me standing there alone, marginalized and erased. And he just looked away, completely unfazed. That was the moment something inside me permanently snapped. For 5 years, I had swallowed their microaggressions. I had smiled politely when Vivian suggested I needed etiquette classes to learn how to host proper dinner parties. I had stayed quiet when Harper gave me backhanded compliments about how brave I was to wear my natural hair in such a formal setting. I endured all of it because I loved Julian. But watching them steal my money and my labor while my husband smiled approvingly was the absolute final straw. The applause slowly died down and the jazz band started playing a lively tune again. The guests resumed their mingling, completely unaware of the massive lie they had just swallowed. I watched Vivian step down from the stage, surrounded by well-wishers. Harper was holding court near the dessert table, accepting compliments on the vanilla bean cake I had specially imported from New York. Julian was shaking hands with a prominent bank executive trying to secure a loan for a property he could not actually afford. I took a deep breath, smoothing down the fabric of my dress. I did not storm over. I did not cry. I did not throw a tantrum. I walked calmly and deliberately through the sea of elite guests, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. I was no longer the desperate wife trying to buy the affection of a family who despised me. I was an auditor, and I was about to close their accounts. As I approached the center of the room, the crowd naturally parted. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Vivian, who was currently laughing at a joke made by a prominent real estate developer. Julian was standing right beside her, nodding enthusiastically while swirling the bourbon in his glass. Harper was on Vivian's other side, holding a delicate porcelain saucer. The moment Vivian caught sight of me, her laughter abruptly died. The warm, gracious expression she wore for the cameras and the wealthy donors vanished, replaced instantly by the tight-lipped sneer she reserved only for me. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, Vivian reached out and intercepted a passing waiter. She grabbed a heavy stack of discarded appetizer plates, smeared with cocktail sauce and remnants of crab cakes. Without missing a beat, she turned and shoved the messy stack directly toward my chest, expecting me to instinctively catch them just like a trained servant. "Be a dear and take these to the kitchen, Camille," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that barely masked her venom. "We all know you are much more comfortable chatting with the kitchen help than mingling with our top-tier investors anyway. Go on now. We are trying to conduct business here." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. A few of the investors standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, but no one said a word. They simply watched, waiting to see how the hired help would react. Julian. My own husband quickly looked down at his shoes, suddenly finding the ice cubes in his bourbon incredibly fascinating. He did not defend me. He never did. I did not reach for the plates. I let my hands remain perfectly still at my sides. Vivian, realizing I was not going to take them, huffed in annoyance and forcefully shoved them into my hands. I grasped the edges of the porcelain, but instead of turning toward the kitchen, I took one step to the right and dropped the entire stack onto a pristine white linen-covered table. The plates landed with a loud, jarring clatter. A crystal glass wobbled and tipped over, spilling water across the expensive fabric. The sharp noise cut through the immediate chatter, drawing the eyes of dozens of guests. Vivian gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in mock horror. "What on earth is wrong with you?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but frantic. "Have you completely lost your mind?" "My mind is perfectly clear, Vivian," I replied, my voice steady and loud enough for the real estate developer and the surrounding guests to hear every single word. "I will not be taking your dirty plates to the kitchen. In fact, I will not be doing a single thing for you ever again. Because unlike everyone else standing in this circle, I do not work for you. I am the one who pays the bills." Vivian scoffed, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "Keep your voice down. You are embarrassing, Julian." "Julian should be embarrassed," I countered, taking a step closer. "He should be deeply embarrassed that his mother is standing on a stage taking credit for a $150,000 gala that his wife completely funded. He should be embarrassed that you are wearing a $5,000 emerald silk gown that I paid for with my credit card yesterday afternoon. And he should absolutely be embarrassed that you are treating the woman who kept your entire family out of bankruptcy like a glorified busboy." The color drained entirely from Vivian's face. The investors standing nearby suddenly looked incredibly interested in the ceiling or their phones, pretending not to hear the spectacular collapse of the Sterling family facade. But they heard everything. In elite Atlanta society, gossip is a currency far more valuable than cash, and I was handing them a gold mine. Julian finally found his voice, stepping forward and grabbing my arm with a tight, painful grip. "Camille, stop it right now," he demanded through gritted teeth. "You are making a scene and you are ruining my mother's special night. Go to the car." I ripped my arm out of his grasp with such force that he stumbled backward. "Do not ever put your hands on me again," I warned, staring him down until he physically shrank back. For the first time in 5 years, I am completely awake to who you people really are. That was when Harper decided to intervene. She glided forward, putting her arm around Vivian's shoulders in a protective, defensive stance. She tilted her head, giving me that patented look of pity and deep concern that she had perfected over the years. It was the exact look she used when she wanted to paint me as the villain while maintaining her own flawless victimhood. "Oh, Camille, please!" Harper cooed, her voice soft and trembling just enough to make anyone listening think I was a physical threat. "Please do not make this an angry thing. We are all just trying to celebrate Vivian tonight. There is no need for this kind of aggression. We know you work hard, but tearing down our family in public is not the right way to handle your insecurities. Let us just take a deep breath and calm down." I looked at Harper. I looked at her perfectly highlighted blonde hair, her innocent wide blue eyes, and the subtle patronizing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She was using the exact buzzwords designed to weaponize my identity against me. Angry, aggressive, insecurities. "Calm down." She was painting the picture of the unhinged, hostile woman attacking the peaceful, gracious family. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I could see the surrounding guests immediately relaxing into the narrative she was spinning. They wanted to believe Harper because believing Harper was easy. Believing Harper meant the Sterling family was still royalty, and I was just an ungrateful outsider causing trouble. "Do not patronize me, Harper," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and devoid of the anger she so desperately wanted me to show. "You stood on that stage and accepted applause for months of hard work that you absolutely did not do. You took credit for the menu, you took credit for the flowers, and you took credit for the venue. The only thing you organized tonight was your own makeup. So do not stand there playing the peacemaker when you are nothing but a comfortable parasite living off the money I bring into this family." Harper's mouth dropped open in genuine shock. No one had ever spoken to her like that. In the Sterling family, Harper was untouchable. She was the pristine prize that Terence had won, and her feelings were to be protected at all costs. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes, and she let out a soft, wounded sob, hiding her face in Vivian's shoulder. Vivian wrapped her arms tightly around Harper, glaring at me with absolute murderous hatred. "Look what you have done, you hateful, jealous girl," Vivian spat. "You have always been jealous of Harper. You have always hated that she belongs here, and you never will. You are nothing but street trash dressed up in expensive clothes. I always told Julian it was a mistake bringing someone of your low breeding into this family. You have no class, no grace, and absolutely no respect." Julian stepped forward again, his chest puffed out, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked at Harper crying softly into his mother's shoulder, and then he looked at me. The disdain in his eyes was absolute. Any lingering trace of the man I thought I had married, the man who had promised to stand by me and build a life together, was completely gone. In his place was a fragile, arrogant little boy terrified of losing his status and furious at the woman who had dared to expose his weakness. "I told you to go to the car!" Julian shouted, his voice echoing slightly over the jazz band. The music faltered. Heads turned from all across the ballroom. The polite murmurs of the wealthy guests completely died away, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. I stood my ground, holding my clutch tightly in my hand. "I am not going anywhere, Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Not until you admit the truth. Tell your mother who paid for this party. Tell your investors who actually funds the Sterling Group. Tell them." Julian stepped dangerously close to me. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see a muscle ticking furiously in his cheek. "You are going to shut your mouth," he whispered venomously, leaning in so only I and his immediate circle could hear. "You are going to shut your mouth right now, and you are going to apologize to Harper. Then you are going to apologize to my mother. If you say one more word about money, I swear to God I will make you regret it." I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for half a decade. I remembered the early days of our relationship when he played the role of the ambitious visionary, and I was the supportive partner helping him build his dreams. I realized now that the entire marriage had been a calculated acquisition. He did not marry a partner. He married a line of credit. And right now, that line of credit was refusing to cooperate and embarrassing him in front of the people he worshipped. "I will not apologize for telling the truth, Julian," I replied, my voice unwavering. "And I will certainly not apologize to two women who have done nothing but disrespect me since the day we met. Your threats do not work on me anymore. You have nothing to threaten me with because you own absolutely nothing." The truth of my words hit him like a physical blow. The absolute reality that I held the keys to his entire kingdom, that I knew every secret debt, every overdrawn account, every desperate loan he had taken out behind his mother's back flashed in his eyes. For a fraction of a second I saw genuine fear. But in a man like Julian, fear quickly metabolizes into violence. He could not win with facts. He could not win with intellect. He was cornered, exposed, and terrified. So he resorted to the only power he felt he still had over me: control through intimidation. "Apologize to my mother," he demanded, his voice rising again, cracking with desperation. "Do it now, Camille." I looked him dead in the eye and smiled. No. The word hung in the air. No. It was a simple word, but in the Sterling family vocabulary, it was an absolute declaration of war. Harper let out another dramatic sob, burying her face deeper into Vivian's shoulder. I turned my attention directly to my sister-in-law, refusing to let her control the narrative for one more second. "Drop the innocent act, Harper," I said, my voice carrying a quiet but absolute authority. "You can fool these investors, and you can fool the country club board, but you cannot fool me. You know exactly what you are doing. You use those fake tears every time someone asks you to take accountability for your own life. You are 32 years old, and you have never worked a single day in your life. You survive on the money that Terence begs his brother for, and Julian survives on the money he begs from me. Terence, who had been hovering near the extravagant dessert table, finally pushed his way through the crowd of onlookers. He pointed a finger at me, his face flushed with anger and deep embarrassment. "Watch your mouth, Camille," he warned, stepping up beside his brother. "You do not get to speak to my wife that way." "Then tell your wife to stop taking credit from my bank account," I shot back without missing a beat. "The entire Sterling Empire is a house of cards, and all of you know it." I turned away from Terence and Harper, locking my eyes entirely on Julian. I looked at the man I had loved, the man I had compromised my own boundaries for year after year. He was trembling with a rage so profound it seemed to vibrate through his expensive tailored tuxedo. His hands were clenched so tightly into fists that his knuckles were stark white against his dark skin. He looked like a cornered animal, terrified that the trap had finally snapped shut. "Look at me, Julian," I demanded, my voice ringing out clearly. "Look me in the eye and tell your mother the truth. Tell the mayor standing right over there. Tell the city council members who are currently sipping the champagne I bought. Tell them who actually funded this beautiful Mother's Day gala. Tell them whose liquidated stock options paid for the catering, the venue, and the valet service outside. Be a man for once in your life, and tell them that without my paycheck, your family would be entirely bankrupt." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every single eye in the grand ballroom was fixed directly on Julian. The elite of Atlanta society were waiting for him to laugh it off, to prove that I was just a hysterical, ungrateful woman making up lies. They were waiting for the powerful chief executive officer to put his erratic wife in her place and reassure them that their massive investments in the Sterling Group were perfectly safe. But Julian could not say a word, because every single word I had just spoken was the undeniable truth. His jaw worked furiously. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. In the toxic culture of his family, disrespect from a woman, especially a woman they considered entirely beneath them, was the ultimate unforgivable sin. He felt his power slipping away. He felt his carefully crafted image shattering in front of the very people he desperately needed to impress. "I am warning you for the last time," Camille Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous guttural pitch. "Apologize to my mother right now, or I swear to God you will regret it." "I will never apologize for exposing a fraud," I replied, standing tall and completely unfazed by his anger. The movement was so fast I barely had time to register it. Julian pulled his right arm back and swung with all his might. Smack! The sound of his open hand striking my face echoed through the massive ballroom like a gunshot. The physical force of the blow snapped my head violently to the side. A sharp, stinging pain exploded across my left cheek, radiating deep down into my jawline. The heavy gold hoop earring I was wearing dug painfully into my skin behind my ear. For a fraction of a second, my vision completely blurred, and I stumbled, taking half a step backward to catch my balance against the white linen table behind me. The jazz band completely stopped playing. A horn player let out a sharp, accidental squeak as he yanked his brass instrument away from his mouth in pure shock. The entire ballroom plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. 300 people stopped breathing all at once. The mayor of Atlanta lowered his champagne glass, his mouth hanging slightly open. Several wealthy socialites covered their mouths with their manicured hands, their eyes wide with disbelief. Julian stood there, his chest heaving, his hands still hovering slightly in the air from the follow-through of the vicious strike. He did not look regretful. He did not look horrified by what he had just done to his wife in front of a crowd. He looked triumphant. In his twisted mind, he had just restored order. He had just disciplined the disobedient outsider and protected his family's fragile honor. Vivian did not gasp. She did not reprimand her son for striking a woman. She simply adjusted her emerald silk shawl and looked at me with cold, satisfied disdain. Harper had stopped crying completely, her wide blue eyes watching me with a mixture of fear and twisted fascination. I slowly turned my head back to face Julian. I did not raise my hand to cradle my stinging cheek. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I absolutely refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I tasted the faint metallic flavor of blood on the inside of my lip where my teeth had caught the soft flesh. I swallowed it down. Julian straightened his tuxedo jacket, pulling the dark lapels tight across his chest. He looked down at me with absolute utter disgust. "Go home," he sneered, his voice carrying clearly through the perfectly silent room. "You are done here. We will handle our divorce in the morning. Get out of my sight." He turned his back on me, dismissing me like a fired employee. He expected me to run out of the country club sobbing in total humiliation. He expected me to hide my bruised face and retreat to the shadows where he firmly believed I belonged. Instead, I reached into my small black designer clutch. My hand was perfectly steady. I pulled out my cell phone, unlocking the screen with a quick swipe of my thumb. The bright light of the screen illuminated my face in the dim ballroom. I tapped the single contact icon I had pinned to the very top of my favorites list. The line connected immediately. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I held the phone to my ear and spoke 4 simple words into the receiver. "Mom, it is time." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my clutch. The wealthy guests were still staring at me, waiting for my next move. Julian had paused mid-step, hearing my calm voice, but he did not turn around. He had no idea what I had just done. He had no idea that my mother was not just a retired public school clerk living in a modest suburban home. He had no idea that my mother, Renee, was the silent, ruthless head of a massive private equity firm that held the financial keys to his entire existence. Julian thought he had just ended our marriage. He thought he had won the war. But he had just given me the final necessary permission to completely destroy him. The physical pain in my cheek was already fading, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifying clarity. I had spent 5 long years playing the supportive wife, trying to heal a broken family that thrived on toxicity and abuse. But my mother had taught me long ago that you cannot heal a parasite. You can only cut it out. I stood my ground in the center of the luxurious room, waiting for the fallout. The Sterling family legacy was built entirely on lies, stolen money, and unearned arrogance. And in exactly 1 hour, it would be reduced to absolute ashes. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom suddenly felt a million miles away. Before the stunned crowd could even begin to whisper or pull out their cell phones to record the aftermath, Terrence sprang into action. He was always the family fixer, the one who handled the messy details and smoothed over the public relations disasters, while Julian took all the credit. Terrence rushed forward, pushing past a group of horrified investors, and grabbed his older brother by the shoulders. He leaned in and whispered frantically into Julian's ear, his eyes darting nervously toward the mayor, who was already being ushered toward the exit by his private security detail. Harper was right behind him. She hooked her arm through Julian's, steering him aggressively toward the private VIP suite, located just off the main dining area. But they were absolutely not going to let me just stand there in the center of the ballroom and speak my mind to the remaining guests. Terrence spun around and marched right up to me. His hand clamped down on my wrist like a vice. His fingers dug painfully into my skin, pinching the nerves, but I absolutely refused to wince or pull away. He yanked me forward, forcing me to follow them out of the main hall and down the dimly lit carpeted corridor. I let him pull me. I did not fight back physically because I knew exactly what they were doing, and I wanted to see exactly how far they would take it. They needed to contain the damage immediately. They needed to isolate the problem before it spread. And in their arrogant eyes, I was the only problem in the room. Terrence shoved me through the heavy oak doors of the VIP lounge. The room was specifically designed for private high-stakes business meetings and discreet negotiations. It smelled of expensive imported cigars and polished mahogany wood. Dark tufted leather couches sat arranged perfectly around a massive glass coffee table. Terrence slammed the heavy door shut behind us, completely cutting off the ambient noise of the horrified gala guests outside. The sudden quiet in the room was suffocating. Julian immediately began pacing the length of the room, running his hands frantically over his head and tugging at the collar of his tailored tuxedo. Harper hurried over to a small mahogany wet bar in the corner. She poured a glass of sparkling water and rushed it over to Julian, handing it to him as if he were a fragile victim who had just suffered a terrible traumatic event. "Oh my God! Julian, are you okay?" Harper asked, her voice dripping with misplaced sympathy and manufactured concern. "You must be so overwhelmed right now. Just breathe, honey. We are going to fix this." I stood near the door, rubbing my wrist where Terrence had grabbed me, leaving bright red marks against my dark skin. My left cheek was currently burning with a dull, relentless, throbbing ache. The side of my face felt hot and tight, where the blood had rushed to the surface of my skin. But not a single person in that VIP room looked at my face. Not a single person asked if I was injured. Not one of them asked if I needed an ice pack or a glass of water. Terrence was already on his cell phone, frantically texting the country club general manager, trying to secure a non-disclosure agreement or figure out how much cash it would take to bribe the staff to keep the violent incident out of the morning social blogs. The heavy oak door swung open again, and Vivian stepped inside. She moved with a terrifying, calculated calm. She did not look rushed. She did not look panicked. She carefully closed the door behind her, pushing it until the brass lock clicked perfectly into place. She did not run over to check on my well-being. She did not express horror or disappointment at her eldest son's violently abusive outburst. She simply stood near the entrance, adjusting the silk shawl over her shoulders, and glared at me with eyes so cold they could have instantly frozen boiling water. "Look at the massive mess you have made," Vivian said, her tone dripping with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "Are you happy now, Camille? Are you completely satisfied with the humiliating spectacle you just put on for the entire city of Atlanta?" I looked at my mother-in-law incredulously. "I put on a spectacle," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she was desperately baiting me for. "Your son just struck me across the face in front of 300 people. He physically assaulted his wife because I asked him to tell his investors the truth about his bank accounts." Vivian waved her manicured hand dismissively, as if a physical assault in public was nothing more than a minor social faux pas that I was rudely exaggerating. "If you knew your place, my son would not have to discipline you," she said, without a single ounce of shame or hesitation. "You provoked him on purpose. You stood out there in front of our most important financial backers, and you deliberately tried to humiliate him. What on earth did you expect him to do, Camille? He is a powerful man under an immense amount of pressure trying to carry the weight of this entire family, and you decided to throw a petty temper tantrum over a catering bill." The word discipline echoed loudly in my mind. She spoke about me as if I were a disobedient dog that needed to be trained with physical force. This was the dark, rotten core of the Sterling family philosophy. To them, I was not a human being with thoughts, feelings, or boundaries. I was a financial asset. And when an asset malfunctions and stops following orders, you strike it until it falls back into line. "You have always been a gold digger from the South Side." Vivian continued, pacing slowly around the edge of the leather couches, treating the room like a courtroom where she was the judge and the jury. "I saw it the very first day Julian brought you to our home. You saw a wealthy, successful family, and you dug your desperate claws in. You came from absolutely nothing. Your mother was just a public school clerk who probably stretched every dollar just to keep the lights on in whatever cramped house you grew up in." She paused, turning to look me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "You thought that because you bring home a decent paycheck from your little corporate accounting job, that you could suddenly dictate how this legacy family operates. You thought you could simply buy your way into our bloodline. But you have absolutely no class, Camille. You have no understanding of how real high society works. In our world, family protects family at all costs. We do not air our financial grievances in public like common street trash." Harper nodded eagerly from the corner of the room, sipping her own glass of sparkling water. "Vivian is exactly right," Camille Harper chimed in, her voice carrying that sickly sweet, patronizing tone she always used to belittle me. "You always try to make every single event about you. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating Vivian and the historic legacy of the Sterling Group. But you just could not stand the fact that I was getting a little bit of well-deserved attention for organizing things. You had to ruin a beautiful evening with your toxic jealousy." I stared at Harper, feeling a deep sense of revulsion. She was a white woman standing in a closed room using her manufactured tears and perceived fragility to completely justify violence against a black woman. She was actively enabling a man who had just committed assault, and she was expertly framing herself and Vivian as the true innocent victims of my supposed aggression. The psychological gymnastics required to reach that conclusion were truly breathtaking. Terrence finally looked up from his cell phone, his face pale and drawn with genuine panic. The mayor left. He announced, his voice hollow and tight. Two of the prominent city council members walked out right behind him. The country club general manager is threatening to call the police unless we guarantee this will be handled quietly and internally. Do you have any idea what you have done, Camille? If the Vanguard Apex investors hear a single whisper about this altercation, they will completely pull our funding. We will lose the commercial property development project on Peachtree Street. The absolute delusion of these people was almost comical. Julian had hit me. Julian was the one who had committed a literal crime in front of hundreds of witnesses. But in their twisted alternate reality, I was the one destroying their business because my face happened to get in the way of his hand. They were terrified of losing their funding. They were terrified of Vanguard Apex Holdings pulling out of their upcoming deal. I felt a slow, cold smile creeping up the right side of my mouth, the side that did not hurt. If they only knew who Vanguard Apex really was, they would already be on their knees begging for mercy. So you are all in complete agreement then, I asked, looking slowly from Julian to Terrence to Harper, and finally resting my gaze on Vivian. You are all perfectly fine with what just happened. You genuinely believe that striking me in public was an appropriate and justified business decision. Julian set his glass down on the mahogany bar with a loud, aggressive thud. Do not twist this into something it is not, he snapped, pointing a finger at my face. I lost my temper for 1 second. But you pushed me to the absolute limit. You were acting completely unhinged and disrespectful. If you had just kept your mouth shut and smiled like a supportive wife, none of this would have ever happened. You made your own bed, Camille. Now you are going to lie in it. I stood in the center of the VIP room, completely surrounded by 4 people who had entirely convinced themselves of their own lies. Not a single person asked if I needed ice. Not a single person asked if my jaw was broken or if my vision was blurry. All they cared about was the public optics. They cared about the investors. They cared about protecting their fake generational legacy. But their gaslighting no longer worked on me. I was not the scared, desperate girl trying to fit into their world anymore. I was simply a demolition expert walking quietly through a condemned building, noting exactly where to place the dynamite. Harper shifted her weight, lifting a hand to adjust the string of pearls resting against her collarbone. She let out a long, dramatic sigh, as if she were a weary preschool teacher dealing with a particularly stubborn toddler. Julian is under so much stress right now, Camille, she said, her voice dripping with that signature Southern condescension. The Sterling Group is expanding. They are handling multi-million-dollar acquisitions. You are just a number cruncher. You sit in a cubicle and look at spreadsheets all day. You really do not understand the immense pressure of managing real wealth and maintaining a legacy. She took another sip of her sparkling water, looking at me over the rim of the glass. Just apologize to him. Apologize to Vivian. If you just show a little bit of humility, we can fix this. We can go back out there and pretend none of this happened. I stared at Harper, letting her words wash over me. A number cruncher. That was exactly how they viewed the woman who held 3 advanced degrees in finance and managed the corporate audits of Fortune 500 companies. I was just a drone to them, a convenient workhorse who lacked the refined pedigree of a woman like Harper. She spoke about real wealth with such profound confidence, completely ignorant of the fact that the very pearls she was currently touching were paid for by a personal loan her husband took out against my retirement account just 6 months ago. Before I could even formulate a response to Harper's absurd monologue, Terrence stepped away from the heavy wooden door. He walked over to a dark oak credenza in the corner of the VIP room and picked up a sleek black leather briefcase. He carried it over to the glass coffee table in the center of the room and set it down with a heavy thud. He clicked the brass locks open and stepped back, allowing his older brother to take over. Julian walked over to the briefcase. The panic and desperation that had flickered in his eyes just moments ago out in the ballroom were completely gone. In their place was a cold, calculating cruelty. He reached inside the leather case and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue clip. He did not hand the papers to me. He tossed them onto the glass coffee table. The thick stack of papers slid across the smooth surface and stopped exactly an inch from my knee. "What is this?" I asked, looking down at the document. "That is your reality check," Julian replied, crossing his arms over his chest. "It is a post-nuptial agreement. Terrence and our legal team drafted it last month. I was waiting for the right time to bring it up, but it seems you have forced my hand tonight." I looked from the document to Julian. "You had your brother draft a post-nuptial agreement behind my back." "I am protecting my family," Julian snapped, his voice hardening. "I am protecting the sterling legacy from a woman who clearly has no respect for it. Read the first page, Camille. It is very simple. You sign this document and you officially waive any and all rights to the Sterling Group properties, our current assets, and any future acquisitions. You will have zero claim to my family wealth. In exchange, you get to keep your little salary, and we will generously agree to overlook your unhinged behavior tonight." Vivian smiled, a tight, satisfied smirk, pulling her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It is a more than fair offer for someone of your background. You should be thanking him." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. The sheer audacity was staggering. They were sitting on a mountain of debt, a mountain they had built with their own incompetence, and they were trying to legally separate themselves from the only person keeping them afloat. They genuinely believed their family name held more value than my actual liquid assets. "And what happens if I refuse to sign it?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm. Julian uncrossed his arms and took a step closer, leaning over the glass table to look me directly in the eyes. "If you do not sign that paper right now, I will file for divorce first thing tomorrow morning. But I will not just leave you, Camille. I will absolutely destroy you." He listed his threats with the practiced ease of a man who was used to bullying his way to the top. "I will freeze every joint account we have. I will lock you out of the house. I will tie you up in litigation for so many years that your legal fees will bleed you completely dry. And then I will make a few phone calls to the board members at your firm. Do you know how many senior partners at your accounting firm play golf with my father? Do you know how many of them rely on our social circle for their own networking and client acquisition?" He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the final blow. "I will tell them that you are mentally unstable. I will say you are prone to violent public outbursts and cannot be trusted with sensitive financial data. I will make sure you never work as a financial auditor in the city of Atlanta ever again." He stood up straight, adjusting his expensive cuffs. "You will be completely blacklisted. You will lose your career, you will lose your reputation, and you will go right back to the South Side where you belong, with absolutely nothing to show for the last 5 years. So I suggest you pick up the pen and sign the paper." The room went completely silent again. Harper was watching me with a look of smug satisfaction, entirely convinced that Julian had just delivered the ultimate checkmate. Terrence stood by the door, playing the role of the loyal guard dog, ensuring I had no route to escape. Vivian looked incredibly bored, as if she were waiting for a simple transaction at a bank counter to finish. They had meticulously planned this. The slap might have been a spontaneous loss of emotional control, but this legal document was a highly calculated ambush. They had been waiting for a moment of weakness, a moment where I was isolated and publicly humiliated, to force me into signing away my rights. They thought the physical assault had broken my spirit. They thought the threat of losing my hard-earned career would terrify me into immediate submission. They thought I was a vulnerable, easily manipulated woman who would crumble under the heavy weight of the mighty Sterling family name. They were so confident in their own superiority that they never once bothered to look closely at the numbers they were trying to protect. They had no idea that I already knew every single secret hidden inside the Sterling Group ledgers. and they certainly had no idea that the mother I was texting was not waiting for me in a cramped suburban house, but was currently sitting in the back of a luxury town car heading straight toward the country club. I looked down at the thick stack of legal papers resting on the glass coffee table. I looked at the heavy, gold-plated pen Julian had tossed right next to it. They were all staring at me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They expected me to start sobbing. They expected me to fall to my knees and beg for my marriage, beg for my financial security, and beg for their forgiveness. Harper even had a condescending look of pity, completely ready on her face, prepared to offer me a tissue the moment the tears started falling. Instead, I let out a laugh. It started as a soft chuckle in the back of my throat, but quickly bubbled up into a genuine full-bodied laugh. The sound bounced off the polished mahogany walls of the VIP room. It was not a hysterical laugh. It was the deep, rich laughter of someone who had just been handed the winning lottery numbers by the exact person trying to rob them. The smug satisfaction vanished from Julian's face, instantly replaced by confusion, and then a deep, boiling anger. He took a step forward, his fists clenching again. "What is so funny?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. "Do you think this is a joke, Camille? Do you think I am playing a game with you? I am holding your entire future in my hands right now." I stopped laughing, but a wide smile remained firmly planted on my face. I reached down and picked up the heavy gold pen. I rolled it slowly between my fingers, feeling the cool metal. I looked directly into Julian's eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, I did not see a husband. I saw a Mark. I saw a man so blinded by his own narcissism that he was enthusiastically digging his own grave. "Julian," I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady, "are you absolutely sure you want to separate our assets tonight? Because I need you to understand something very clearly. Once I sign my name on this document, there is no going back. The lines are drawn permanently. Are you entirely certain this is the move you want to make?" Julian let out a sharp, arrogant scoff. He ran a hand over his tailored lapels, puffing out his chest. He looked at Terence, who smirked, and then back at me. "Am I sure?" he mocked, shaking his head as if I were the stupidest person he had ever met. "Let me explain the real world to you, Camille, since you clearly lack the capacity to understand it. I am the chief executive officer of a third-generation luxury real estate empire. The Sterling Group is currently finalizing a $40 million commercial development deal on Peachtree Street, backed by Vanguard Apex Holdings. I am about to bring in revenue that you could not even comprehend." He took another step closer, pointing a finger down at the post-nuptial agreement. "You are a corporate auditor. You sit at a desk in a gray cubicle, and you crunch numbers for a living. What do you make in a year? 150,000. Maybe 200,000 if you get a good bonus. You drive a sensible sedan, and you buy your clothes off the rack. You have absolutely no concept of what generational wealth looks like. So yes, Camille, I am absolutely sure I want to separate my multi-million-dollar empire from your measly little paycheck. I am not going to let a Southside gold digger walk away with half of my family legacy just because she managed to stick around for 5 years." Vivian stepped forward, crossing her arms tightly over her emerald gown. "Stop wasting time, Julian. She is just trying to stall because she knows she has absolutely nothing without you. Make her sign it and get her out of this club. The sight of her is making me physically ill." Harper nodded vigorously in agreement. "You really should just sign it, Camille. It is the dignified thing to do. You do not want Julian to get his high-powered lawyers involved. They will completely crush you in court. Just take whatever small allowance he is offering and go back to your mother. I am sure she has a spare room for you." I looked down at the document again. I flipped past the cover page and began reading the clauses. Terence had used a standard aggressive boilerplate contract. It was designed to completely protect the Sterling family from any claims I might make in the event of a divorce. But because they assumed I was broke, and they assumed they were rich, the language was absolute. I read paragraph 4 out loud, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "All assets, properties, and financial holdings acquired by the Sterling Group prior to and during the marriage, remain the sole and exclusive property of Julian Sterling. The party of the second part, that is me, waives any and all rights to claim ownership, profit, or alimony derived from these assets. I flipped to the next page, running my finger down the heavy black text. And here is paragraph 7. All debts, liabilities, and financial obligations acquired by either party shall remain the sole responsibility of the individual who incurred them. Neither party shall be held liable for the debts of the other. I looked up at Terence, who was watching me with his arms crossed. "You drafted this, Terence?" I asked. "I had our legal team draft it," Terence replied proudly. "It is completely ironclad, Camille. Do not even try to look for a loophole. You get your personal checking account, your retirement fund, and your car. Julian gets everything else. It is non-negotiable." "It is absolutely beautiful, Terence," I said, giving him a genuine nod of approval. "You really thought of everything." Julian slammed his hand flat on the glass table, rattling the document. "Stop reading and sign the damn paper, Camille. I am losing my patience." I did not hesitate for another second. I clicked the gold pen and pressed it to the thick paper. I signed my name on the first line. I flipped the page and initialed the second. I flipped again and signed the final signature block, pressing down hard enough to leave an indent on the wood underneath the glass. I signed away my rights to the Sterling legacy with a massive flourish. They thought they were destroying me. They thought this document was a weapon that would force me into poverty and submission. But my auditor brain was already running the exact numbers they were too arrogant to check. The Sterling Group did not have a multi-million-dollar empire. They had zero liquid capital. The Peachtree Street development was completely stalled because they had defaulted on their initial loan payments. Their mansion was mortgaged to the absolute maximum limit. Their luxury cars were leased and 3 months behind on payments. The $40 million Julian kept bragging about was not revenue. It was a massive predatory commercial debt owed entirely to Vanguard Apex Holdings. A debt that was about to be called in tonight. And then there was my side of the ledger. Julian thought I made a modest low 6-figure salary because that was the only account I ever let him see. He never bothered to actually learn what I did at my firm. He never bothered to ask how I became a senior partner at 35. He had no idea that I specialized in corporate restructuring and hostile takeovers. He had no idea that my firm paid me primarily in private equity stock options. Just last month, my firm went public. I had quietly cashed out a portion of my portfolio. While Julian was drowning in $40 million of toxic debt, I was sitting on $15 million of pure liquid cash. Cash that I had earned completely on my own. Cash that was currently sitting in a private offshore trust that Julian knew absolutely nothing about. By forcing me to sign this post-nuptial agreement, Julian had just legally walled off my $15 million. He had just legally declared that his $40 million debt was his and his alone. He had built a massive financial firewall between us and locked himself on the side that was currently burning to the ground. I capped the gold pen and placed it neatly next to the signed documents. I stood up straight, smoothing out the front of my dress. The stinging in my cheek was completely forgotten, replaced by the electric thrill of absolute victory. "It is done," I said, pushing the stack of papers across the glass table toward Julian. "We are officially financially separated." Julian snatched the papers off the table, checking to make sure my signatures were actually there. When he saw my ink on the dotted line, a massive wave of relief and triumph washed over his face. He let out a deep breath, rolling his shoulders back, as if a huge weight had been lifted off him. He handed the papers to Terence, who quickly placed them back into the leather briefcase and locked it with a loud, satisfying click. "Smartest decision you have ever made," Camille Julian said, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face. "Now get out of this club. Security is waiting in the hallway. I will have my assistant send your things to your mother's house tomorrow morning. Do not ever contact me again." Vivian let out a sharp, delighted laugh. "Good riddance," she muttered, turning her back to me and walking over to the wet bar to pour herself a celebratory drink. Harper gave me one last pitiful wave, totally thrilled that her position as the favorite daughter-in-law was now completely secure and unchallenged. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my black clutch and turned toward the heavy oak door. I had exactly what I needed. Julian had signed his own death warrant and handed it directly to me with a bow on top. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The country club security guards were indeed waiting, standing with their arms crossed, looking imposing and ready to throw me out. But as I stepped into the dim light of the corridor, I saw the head of security push past them. He did not look angry. He looked directly at me, his face entirely serious, and he held a highly classified iPad in his hands. The real show was finally about to begin. As my hand rested on the cool brass handle of the VIP room door, I heard the immediate eruption of celebration behind me. Julian let out a loud, triumphant whoop that echoed off the polished mahogany walls. It was the sound of a man who genuinely believed he had just outsmarted his greatest enemy. I paused for a fraction of a second, leaving the heavy oak door cracked open just enough to witness their pathetic victory lap. Terrence had practically sprinted back to the wet bar, grabbing a fresh bottle of extremely expensive aged scotch. I listened to the sharp clinking of crystal glasses as the two brothers poured heavy celebratory drinks. They clapped each other on the shoulder, laughing with the reckless arrogance of men who had never been held accountable for a single mistake in their entire lives. They were toasting to their brilliant legal maneuvering. They were toasting to the preservation of a generational legacy that was currently burning to the ground right under their expensive leather shoes. Vivian, however, was not content with simply letting me walk away quietly. She needed to extract every single ounce of humiliation she could from this situation. She needed the absolute final word, and she desperately wanted an audience for it. I turned my head slightly, watching through the narrow gap in the doorway as she pulled a sleek, gold-plated smartphone from her designer emerald clutch. She dialed a number with sharp, aggressive taps of her manicured fingernails and hit the speaker button. She set the phone down on the glass coffee table right next to the post-nuptial agreement, making sure everyone in the room could hear the destruction of my reputation. The line rang twice before the country club general manager answered. Vivian instantly transformed her voice. The cold, venomous tone she had used with me completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by the frantic, breathless cadence of a terrified high society matron who was actively being threatened. "Yes, Richard. This is Vivian Sterling," she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, even though the man on the phone could not see her. "We have a severe security issue in the private VIP suite. My former daughter-in-law has become completely unhinged. She is acting violently and making threatening remarks against my family. I need your head of security down here immediately to have her physically escorted off the premises. She is trespassing, and I want her removed before she causes any more trauma to my guests or damages the property." Richard, the general manager, immediately began apologizing profusely through the speakerphone. He promised Vivian that his top men were already on their way and assured her that the Sterling family would be entirely protected. Vivian ended the call with a deeply satisfied smirk, picking up her own glass of imported champagne. "Good riddance to bad rubbish," she muttered, taking a delicate sip and looking completely triumphant. I pushed the door open wider, ready to finally step out into the hallway, but a soft hand clamped down on my shoulder. I stopped and turned my head. Harper had followed me to the threshold. Her bright blue eyes were wide and shining with that familiar toxic innocence she always weaponized against me. She tilted her head, giving me a sickeningly sweet smile of false pity. She gently patted my shoulder as if I were a stray dog she was feeling deeply sorry for, before sending it away to the local pound. "Do not worry about coming back to the house to pack your things tomorrow." Camille Harper cooed, her voice soft enough that the brothers across the room would not hear the absolute malice dripping from her words. "I will have the maid pack up all your cheap clothes and put them in garbage bags by the service entrance, so you do not have to show your face. Maybe your mom can let you sleep on her couch in the hood until you figure out what to do with your miserable, ruined life." I looked down at Harper's hand resting on my custom-tailored silk dress. I looked at the heavy string of pearls around her neck. Pearls that her husband had bought using a personal loan taken directly against my private retirement account. The sheer racial and class microaggressions packed into that single condescending sentence were staggering. She assumed that because I was a black woman from the south side of the city, my mother automatically lived in extreme poverty. She assumed my clothes were cheap simply because they did not have the flashy, oversized designer logos that the completely broke Sterling family loved to constantly flaunt. She was projecting her own deep financial insecurities onto me, standing there acting like she owned a sprawling mansion that was actually 3 months away from a total bank foreclosure. I did not raise my hand to swat her away. I did not give her the angry reaction she was desperately hoping to capture. I simply stared at her with a look of absolute chilling calm until her fake smile faltered and she awkwardly pulled her hand back to her side. "You should really focus on packing your own bags, Harper," I said, my voice low and perfectly steady, "because by this time tomorrow those pearls around your neck are going to be the legal property of the bank." I stepped out of the VIP room and pulled the heavy oak door completely open behind me. I did not let it shut. I wanted them to have a front row seat for what was about to happen. The long corridor outside the main ballroom was dimly lit with elegant crystal wall sconces, casting long shadows across the thick patterned carpet. At the far end of the hallway, the heavy double doors swung open violently, and a team of 4 massive security guards marched quickly toward me. They were dressed in sharp black suits with coiled earpieces tucked behind their ears, looking like a private military detail, ready to neutralize a high-level physical threat. Julian and Vivian stepped out of the VIP room right behind me, drawn into the hallway by the heavy sound of marching footsteps. Julian leaned casually against the wooden doorframe, holding his glass of scotch with a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his face. He was eagerly waiting to see the South Side girl physically dragged out of his prestigious country club. He wanted to watch me struggle and cry as I was thrown out into the warm Atlanta night in front of the valet staff. The security guards closed the distance quickly, moving with aggressive tactical precision. Leading the pack was the head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face. Vivian pointed her manicured finger directly at my back. "There she is," Vivian called out, her voice echoing loudly down the elegant corridor. "Remove this woman from the property immediately. If she resists, call the local police and have her arrested and charged with trespassing." The 4 security guards stopped right in front of me, forming a solid, intimidating wall of black suits. Julian took a slow sip of his drink, waiting for the violent struggle to begin. He waited for them to grab my arms and drag me away. But the head of security did not reach out to grab me. He did not pull out a pair of metal handcuffs. He did not even look the slightest bit angry. Instead, the imposing man stopped a respectful 3 feet away from me. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black corporate iPad. He looked past my shoulder, locking eyes with Julian for a brief second before returning his full, unwavering attention to me. The head of security slowly lowered his head in a deep, respectful nod, acknowledging my absolute authority over the entire situation. He held the highly classified device out to me with both hands, waiting for my next command. The heavy silence in the corridor was broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. Julian stood completely frozen, his smug smile sliding right off his face and shattering onto the patterned carpet. Vivian lowered her pointing finger, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. They both stared in absolute disbelief at the towering head of security, who had just bowed his head to the woman they considered to be garbage. I reached out and took the sleek black iPad from his large hands. The device was heavy and cool to the touch. The screen was already unlocked, glowing brightly in the dim hallway. I did not look at Julian. I did not look at Vivian. I looked directly at the head of security and gave him a single approving nod. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Julian finally exploded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and deep confusion. "I told you to grab her. I told you to throw her out into the street. Do you have any idea who I am? I am a platinum member of this club. I will have you fired. I will have your entire security company bankrolled and liquidated by tomorrow morning." The head of security, a man whose name tag read David, did not even flinch. He stood perfectly upright, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. He looked at Julian with an expression of pure professional apathy. "I am afraid that will not be possible, Mr. Sterling," David replied, his deep voice echoing down the corridor. "My employer has strictly instructed me to assist this young lady with whatever she requires tonight. You no longer have the authority to issue commands on these premises." Julian stepped forward, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "Your employer works for Richard, and Richard answers to the board of directors, and I sit on that board. I am ordering you to remove my ex-wife from this building right now." David did not move a single inch. "Actually, sir, my security firm was acquired last week by Vanguard Apex Holdings, and the executives at Vanguard Apex have made it abundantly clear that Camille is our top priority tonight." The name Vanguard Apex Holdings hit Julian like a physical blow to the stomach. It was the exact private equity firm that held his $40 million commercial debt. It was the firm he thought was backing his massive real estate expansion. He had spent the entire evening bragging to the mayor and the city council about his incredible relationship with Vanguard Apex. Hearing that they had bought the security company and were actively protecting me completely short-circuited his brain. Vivian furiously tapped the screen of her gold-plated smartphone, trying to redial the general manager. "Richard is not answering," she hissed, her voice laced with genuine rising panic. "The line is completely dead, Julian. Something is very wrong." Harper pressed her back against the wooden doorframe of the VIP room, her hands flying up to clutch her stolen pearls. Her fake innocent act evaporated instantly, replaced by the raw, cowardly fear of a woman who realized she had backed the wrong horse. She looked at me holding the iPad surrounded by a wall of imposing guards, and she finally understood that I was not the victim she thought I was. I looked down at the glowing screen of the iPad. It was preloaded with the master audiovisual control dashboard for the entire country club. My mother, Renee, left absolutely nothing to chance. When she acquired a company, she acquired all of its assets, all of its contracts, and all of its leverage. She knew exactly what Julian and Vivian would try to do to me tonight. She knew they would try to humiliate me and throw me out, so she made sure I held the remote control to their entire fake world. The dashboard was incredibly intuitive. It displayed the lighting grids, the sound systems, the projector feeds, and the microphone frequencies for every single room in the massive building. I located the tab labeled Grand Ballroom and tapped it with my index finger. Julian took another aggressive step toward me, reaching out to snatch the device from my hands. "Give me that," he demanded. Before his fingers could even graze the edge of the iPad, David stepped smoothly into his path. The massive security guard placed a flat, open hand squarely against Julian's chest and shoved him backward. The push was effortless, but it contained enough physical force to send Julian stumbling back several feet. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the carpet, and he crashed hard against the wall, spilling the rest of his expensive scotch down the front of his tailored tuxedo. "Do not touch her," David warned, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. The three other security guards immediately closed ranks, stepping forward to form a solid, impenetrable wall of black suits between the Sterling family and me. Terrence rushed out of the VIP room to help his brother up, but he froze the moment he saw the security detail moving into a defensive formation. Terrence was a coward at his core. He liked drafting aggressive legal documents behind closed doors, but he had absolutely no stomach for a physical confrontation. He grabbed Julian's arm, pulling him away from the guards. I ignored their pathetic scuffle and turned my attention back to the screen. I saw a button labeled Main Chandelier Lighting. I tapped it once. Through the heavy double doors at the end of the hallway, I heard the immediate collective gasp of 300 elite guests. The warm golden glow spilling under the doorframe instantly vanished. I tapped the secondary emergency lighting grid. The crack beneath the doors lit up with a harsh, dramatic blood-red hue. The entire ballroom had just been plunged into a deep crimson warning light, signaling to everyone inside that something was terribly wrong. Vivian let out a sharp, terrified shriek. "What did you just do?" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are ruining my gala. You are ruining my reputation." I did not answer her. I tapped the second button on the screen labeled Band Audio Feed. The smooth, lively jazz music that had been playing continuously all evening cut off abruptly right in the middle of an upbeat saxophone solo. The sudden absolute silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Without the music, the muffled sounds of confused chatter and nervous questions from the wealthy guests drifted out into the hallway. Julian pushed Terence away and wiped the spilled scotch from his ruined tuxedo jacket. "Camille, stop this right now," he ordered, but his voice was trembling. He was no longer the arrogant chief executive officer dictating terms. He was a terrified little boy watching his expensive toys get taken away. "You are making a massive mistake. If you embarrass Vanguard Apex, they will pull our funding. They will ruin us both." He still did not understand. He still thought Vanguard Apex was a faceless corporate entity that cared about his real estate projects. He had no idea that Vanguard Apex was simply my mother pulling the strings to teach him a lesson he would never forget. I found the third button on the dashboard labeled Master Microphone Override. I tapped it, and a small green light blinked on the screen, indicating that the microphone built into the iPad was now broadcasting directly to the massive surround sound speakers inside the ballroom. I leaned in close to the device and tapped my fingernail sharply against the microphone grill. A loud, jarring screech of audio feedback blasted through the country club. The high-pitched metallic squeal was so loud that Vivian and Harper both clamped their hands over their ears, squeezing their eyes shut in pain. The screech echoed down the corridor, bouncing off the polished mahogany walls and tearing through the remaining shreds of the Sterling family dignity. The audio feedback settled into a low, steady hum, indicating that the channel was completely open and waiting for my voice. I looked up from the screen and stared directly at Julian. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He finally realized that the post-nuptial agreement he forced me to sign was not a weapon to destroy me. It was a shield I had allowed him to build, so I could walk away completely unscathed while his entire world burned down. "You wanted me to leave, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm, refusing to broadcast into the microphone just yet. "You told me I was done here, but I paid for this venue until midnight, and as an auditor, I absolutely hate leaving paid assets on the table." I tucked the iPad securely under my arm. The wall of security guards parted perfectly down the middle, creating a clear, unobstructed path for me toward the heavy ballroom doors. The red light from the main hall spilled out into the corridor, casting long, dark shadows across the carpet. Julian, Vivian, Terence, and Harper stood huddled together near the VIP room, looking like frightened hostages trapped in a nightmare they had entirely created for themselves. I smoothed down the front of my custom gown and took a deep breath. It was time to give the elite of Atlanta exactly what they came for, a show they would never forget. I took my first step toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the end of the corridor. The sharp click of my heel against the polished floor finally snapped Julian out of his paralyzed state of shock. The terrifying realization that I was about to expose his entire fraudulent empire to his most important investors completely overrode whatever fear he had of the massive security detail. He lunged forward desperately, reaching out to grab my bare arm and physically drag me back into the isolation of the VIP room. He did not even make it within 2 feet of me. The bodyguard standing to my left, a man who looked like he spent his weekends flipping tractor tires, simply stepped into Julian's path and raised a single massive arm. He caught Julian squarely in the chest with an open palm and shoved him backward with terrifying ease. Julian stumbled wildly, his arms flailing as his expensive leather shoes lost all traction on the patterned carpet. He crashed hard into the wall for the second time, letting out a sharp gasp as the air was knocked completely out of his lungs. Vivian shrieked, rushing forward to check on her precious golden boy, but she made sure to keep a very safe distance from the wall of black suits. "You cannot do this!" Vivian screamed, her perfectly styled hair finally starting to come loose from its tight, immaculate bun. "You are destroying our family. We will sue you for everything you have. We will completely destroy your life." I did not turn my head to acknowledge her empty threats. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the double doors ahead of me. David, the head of security, walked closely to my right, while the second massive bodyguard flanked my left. They moved with absolute military precision, creating an impenetrable moving fortress around me. Terrence and Harper stayed pressed against the far wall of the VIP room, too terrified to even breathe loudly, let alone intervene. Harper was gripping her pearls so tightly her knuckles were stark white, finally realizing that her wealthy fairy tale was violently collapsing. As we reached the end of the corridor, David reached out and pushed the heavy double doors open. The brass hinges let out a soft groan. I stepped out of the dim hallway and back into the massive grand ballroom. The transformation of the room was absolutely staggering. Just 20 minutes ago, this space had been a golden, glowing testament to the Sterling family wealth. It had been filled with the lively sounds of jazz, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the polite laughter of Atlanta's most elite socialites. Now it looked like a high-stakes crime scene. The emergency blood-red lighting cast dark, dramatic shadows across the panicked faces of the 300 guests. The absolute silence was deafening, broken only by the nervous shuffling of expensive shoes and the occasional confused, frightened whisper. I began my long walk toward the front of the room. The crowd of wealthy investors, city council members, and local politicians instinctively parted, creating a wide, clear path right down the center of the ballroom. They stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. 10 minutes ago, they had watched my husband slap me across the face and order me to go home. They had watched me stand there isolated and publicly humiliated by the powerful chief executive officer. Now they were watching me return flanked by a private security detail that looked ready to go to war, moving with the cold, calculating confidence of an absolute conqueror. I saw the mayor of Atlanta standing near the melting ice sculpture, his private security detail hovering nervously around him. He looked at me, and then looked past me toward the open ballroom doors, where Julian was currently stumbling into the room, looking completely disheveled, frantic, and weak. The powerful bank executives, who had been aggressively shaking Julian's hand and promising him lucrative loans earlier in the evening, were now clutching their drinks, staring at the red lights, and sensing that a massive financial disaster was about to unfold. In the ruthless world of high finance, optics are absolutely everything. And right now, the Sterling family optics were in a total catastrophic freefall. I kept my posture perfectly straight, holding the classified iPad securely under my arm. I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who held all the cards. I could feel the energy in the room shifting. The wealthy socialites who had previously looked at me with thinly veiled pity or outright disdain were now stepping back, pulling their silk dresses out of my way as if brushing against me might cause them to catch fire. They recognized power when they saw it, and they were suddenly deeply terrified of mine. I reached the edge of the small raised stage at the front of the room. The jazz band members were still frozen in their places, clutching their brass instruments, looking completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in authority. I gave the saxophone player a polite, reassuring nod and walked up the 3 carpeted steps. David stood squarely at the bottom of the stairs, crossing his massive arms over his chest, daring anyone in the room to try and stop me. The second bodyguard mirrored his exact defensive stance on the opposite side of the stage. I walked directly to the center of the stage, stopping right on the exact spot where Vivian had stood just 20 minutes prior when she was soaking up the unearned applause for the event I funded. I placed the sleek black iPad onto the clear acrylic podium in front of me. I looked out over the massive sea of faces. 300 of the most powerful, wealthy, and influential people in the city were staring up at me, waiting with bated breath. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Julian, Vivian, Terrence, and Harper finally make their way into the back of the ballroom. They were pushing frantically through the crowd, trying to reach the front, but the guests were no longer moving out of their way to accommodate them. The elite crowd could smell blood in the water. They wanted to hear exactly what I had to say, and they were actively blocking the Sterling family from shutting me down. Julian was shouting my name, his voice cracking with pure, desperate panic, but his words were completely swallowed by the sheer size of the room and the thick, suffocating tension hanging in the air. I did not need to use the physical microphone attached to the stand. The iPad was still actively broadcasting directly to the massive surround sound speakers mounted on the walls and ceiling of the country club. I leaned forward, resting both of my hands on the smooth, cool edges of the acrylic podium. I took one final deep breath, letting the heavily air-conditioned air fill my lungs. The stinging pain in my left cheek was completely gone. The years of biting my tongue, swallowing my pride, and shrinking myself to fit into their toxic, abusive little box were officially over. I was a senior partner at a top-tier financial auditing firm. I dismantled fraudulent companies for a living. I spent my days exposing lies, tracking hidden offshore accounts, and tearing down the false facades of arrogant men who thought they were entirely untouchable. And it was finally time to dismantle this one. I looked directly at the wealthy investors standing in the front row, the men and women who held the fate of the Sterling Group in their pristine, manicured hands. The room was so painfully quiet, you could hear a pin drop on the hardwood floor. I reached out and tapped the screen of the iPad, ensuring the audio feed was perfectly clear and ready to broadcast. It was time to show them exactly what they had been investing in. I leaned forward slightly, bringing my face closer to the sleek black iPad resting on the acrylic podium. The highly sensitive microphone picked up the soft sound of my breathing and broadcast it instantly through the massive surround sound speakers echoing off the high ceilings of the ballroom. The sheer amplification of that single breath sent a visible ripple through the crowd. Every single person in the room was completely paralyzed, waiting for my first words. 10 minutes ago, my husband slapped me across the face, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute crystal clarity. The collective gasp from the 300 elite guests sounded like all the oxygen was suddenly sucked out of the room. A few women in the front row covered their mouths in genuine horror. The mayor of Atlanta, who had been quietly conversing with his security detail, whipped his head around to stare directly at Julian. In the world of high society, whispers of domestic disputes were common, but a public physical assault confirmed by the victim on a live microphone was an absolute scandal that no politician or investor wanted to be anywhere near. 5 minutes ago, he forced me into the private VIP suite. I continued, my voice perfectly steady, refusing to let a single tremor of emotion bleed into the audio feed. He had his brother Terrence present me with a pre-drafted post-nuptial agreement. He threatened to destroy my career and freeze all of my bank accounts if I did not immediately sign away my rights to the Sterling family fortune. He told me he needed to protect his massive empire from a Southside gold digger who contributed absolutely nothing to his historic legacy. I paused, letting the heavy weight of those words sink into the minds of the wealthy socialites and powerful bank executives standing before me. I looked toward the back of the room where Julian was aggressively trying to push his way through the dense crowd. He was shouting at the top of his lungs, but his words were completely drowned out by the sheer volume of the speaker system. The two massive bodyguards flanking the stage stepped forward, slightly cracking their knuckles and silently daring him to get any closer. "It is incredibly funny that he forced me to sign that document," I said, allowing a small, cold smile to touch the corners of my mouth. "Because according to the comprehensive corporate audit I just completed, the Sterling Group has been entirely bankrupt for 3 years. The silence in the ballroom shattered into a million pieces. The room erupted into absolute chaotic frenzy. Wealthy investors dropped their crystal champagne flutes onto the hardwood floor, sending shattered glass and expensive alcohol flying everywhere. Men in tailored suits immediately reached into their pockets, pulling out their smartphones to furiously dial their financial advisors and risk management teams. The polite murmurs of high society were instantly replaced by angry shouts and frantic demands for immediate answers. Julian finally broke through the edge of the crowd, stopping about 20 feet from the stage. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and violent rage. "Shut the microphone off," he screamed, his voice cracking in desperation. "Do not listen to her. She is a hysterical, crazy woman. I asked her for a divorce, and now she is making up vicious lies to ruin my family. She has absolutely no idea what she is talking about." I did not raise my voice to compete with his shouting. I simply let the microphone amplify my calm, collected tone. "I am a senior partner at one of the top financial auditing firms in the country, Julian," I replied, looking directly down at him. "Knowing exactly what I am talking about is literally what I do for a living. I know exactly how you operate. I know that you have been using funds from new Vanguard Apex investors to quietly pay off the massive interest on your old defaulted loans. You are not running a luxury real estate empire. You are running a glorified Ponzi scheme wrapped in expensive tailored suits and fake generational arrogance. Terrence, who had followed his brother through the crowd, suddenly looked incredibly sick. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in the harsh red emergency lighting. He knew the strict legal implications of what I was saying. He knew that if the investors in this room pulled their funding based on my public audit, the Sterling Group would not just face simple bankruptcy, they would face federal fraud charges. Vivian tried to save whatever shredded dignity she had left. She pushed her way to the front, standing right next to her sons. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger up at me. "You are a liar!" Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the angry crowd. "You have always been jealous of our wealth. Our properties are worth millions. We are the Sterling family. Your properties are heavily mortgaged to the absolute maximum limit, Vivian." I countered, my voice slicing through her pathetic defense like a warm knife through butter. "The multi-million-dollar Peachtree Street commercial development that you have been bragging about all night has been completely stalled for 6 months because your son bounced 3 consecutive checks to the construction firm. The luxury cars you drove here tonight are leased and currently 90 days past due. And this spectacular $150,000 gala that you so graciously took credit for was paid for entirely by my corporate salary and my liquidated stock options." The crowd turned on them instantly. A prominent bank executive who had been considering extending a massive line of credit to Julian just an hour ago stepped forward, his face red with fury. "Is this true?" Julian, the executive, demanded loudly. "Have you been lying to the board about your liquid assets? Did you actually assault your wife because she found out you are completely broke?" Julian threw his hands up in a defensive panic. "No, absolutely not," he stammered, taking a step backward as the angry investors began closing in around him. "She is just angry. She has no proof. It is her word against mine, and she is just a bitter ex-wife trying to cause a scene. There is absolutely no proof of anything she is saying." I looked at the bank executive who had demanded the truth. "I want to make one thing perfectly clear to everyone in this room," I said, directing my attention to the angry investors. 5 minutes ago, my husband forced me to sign a post-nuptial agreement. He aggressively demanded that all assets and debts be strictly separated. He thought he was legally walling me out of his multi-million-dollar fortune. But what Julian did not realize is that my firm recently went public. I am currently sitting on $15 million in private equity stock options. By forcing me to sign that document, Julian legally protected my $15 million from his impending bankruptcy. And he legally bound himself to the $40 million of toxic debt that is about to crush his entire family. Harper was suddenly nowhere to be seen. The moment she heard the words Ponzi scheme and toxic debt, she had quietly slipped toward the side exit, desperately trying to distance herself from the sinking ship she had so proudly defended just 20 minutes earlier. She was perfectly happy to play the role of the golden daughter-in-law when the money was flowing. But the second the illusion shattered, she abandoned them without a single backward glance. Julian continued to lie to the faces of the furious investors, pleading with them to believe his family legacy over my words. He desperately clung to the idea that because I was a black woman from the south side of Atlanta, these wealthy, elite men would naturally side with him. He thought his expensive suit and his familiar last name would automatically shield him from any real accountability. He kept shouting the word proof over and over again, genuinely believing that since I was standing on the stage with nothing but an iPad, I could not possibly back up my claims. But Julian forgot one very important detail about the woman he had married. He forgot that I was a professional auditor. And an auditor never makes a public claim without bringing the undeniable receipts. I tapped the screen of the classified iPad, closing the microphone control panel and opening the master visual display folder my mother had securely uploaded for me. I looked out at the furious crowd and the terrified Sterling family. "You want proof, Julian?" I asked, my voice echoing with cold, absolute finality. Turn around and look at the screens. I pressed a single button on the smooth glass surface of the iPad. Above me, the three massive LED screens that dominated the front of the grand ballroom instantly flickered. For the entire evening, those screens had been playing a continuous glowing video montage of Vivian Sterling. It was a carefully curated loop of her smiling graciously at charity galas, cutting ribbons at real estate developments, and waving to cameras while dripping in expensive jewelry. It was a towering digital monument to her fake perfection. With one tap of my finger, that monument was completely obliterated. The airbrushed images of Vivian vanished. In their place, the screens flashed a stark, blinding white, casting a harsh, sterile glare over the stunned crowd. The bright white background was immediately populated by high-resolution scans of official financial documents. I had meticulously prepared this presentation using the exact same software I used to brief the boards of Fortune 500 companies. The documents were heavily redacted in all the necessary places to protect my own firm from liability, but the catastrophic numbers belonging to the Sterling Group were left completely entirely exposed. The visual contrast was absolutely jarring. The ballroom was still bathed in the dramatic blood-red emergency lighting from the wall sconces, but the stage was illuminated by the cold, hard math of total financial ruin glowing on the 40-foot screens. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. It was the sound of 300 incredibly wealthy people simultaneously realizing they had been completely conned. Men in expensive tailored suits physically stepped closer to the stage, narrowing their eyes to read the massive black text. The prominent bank executives, who had been laughing and drinking with Julian just an hour ago, were now staring up at the screens with expressions of absolute undisguised horror. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I simply allowed the professional corporate auditor inside me to take complete control. I was no longer the abused wife standing in the shadows. I was a financial surgeon, and I was about to dissect a dead company right in front of its most important investors. Let us start with the primary operating account, I announced, my voice projecting smoothly through the hijacked surround sound system. I swiped my finger to the left on the iPad. The massive center screen transitioned seamlessly to a blown-up scan of a corporate bank statement dated just 3 days ago. I used the digital laser pointer feature on the tablet, circling the bottom line figure in bright red, so no one in the back of the room could possibly miss it. As you can all clearly see, the Sterling Group primary operating ledger currently holds a negative balance of $412,000, I explained, keeping my cadence methodical and completely devoid of emotion. This is not a temporary cash flow disruption. If you look at the columns to the right, you will see the quarterly trends. This specific account has been operating deeply in the red for 8 consecutive months. The company has absolutely no liquid capital to cover its daily operating expenses. Julian pushed against the edge of the crowd, his face slick with desperate sweat. "Those are forged!" he screamed, his voice cracking terribly. "She hacked into the system and manufactured those documents. Do not look at them. It is a complete lie." "Shut your mouth." Julian, a senior vice president of a major Atlanta investment bank, snapped loudly from the front row. He did not even look back at my husband. His eyes were glued entirely to the massive screen, his face tight with fury. "Let her finish the presentation." Julian shrunk back, completely emasculated by a man whose money he desperately needed. I did not even break my rhythm. I swiped the screen again, bringing up a complex web of wire transfers and loan originations. "You have all been told about the magnificent $40 million commercial development on Peachtree Street." I continued navigating the complicated financial data with absolute ease. "Julian has spent the entire evening promising you incredible returns on this upcoming project. But the truth is, the Peachtree Street development does not actually exist." The crowd erupted into angry murmurs, but I quickly silenced them by tapping the microphone. "Please direct your attention to the left screen," I instructed. "The $40 million Julian secured from Vanguard Apex Holdings was never allocated to construction or permits. Instead, the funds were immediately broken down and diverted into dozens of smaller shell accounts. Those funds were then used to quietly pay off the massive compounding interest on 3 older commercial loans that the Sterling Group had completely defaulted on 2 years ago. Julian is not building a real estate empire. He is running a textbook corporate Ponzi scheme using new investor money to desperately plug the holes of his massive historical failures. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. The investors in the room realized instantly that they were not just looking at a failing business, they were looking at massive federal wire fraud. The legal implications hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. Terrence was now leaning heavily against a cocktail table in the back, looking like he was about to physically vomit. As the family lawyer, he knew exactly how much prison time was currently flashing on the screens above my head, but I was not finished. Exposing the corporate fraud was only half of the objective. The Sterling family had used their perceived social superiority to abuse me for 5 years. They believed their high society status made them untouchable. It was time to strip that illusion away entirely. Now let us move away from the corporate ledgers and take a look at the personal assets, I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, piercing tone. I swiped to the next slide. The complex corporate wire transfers disappeared, replaced by a very simple, very recognizable document. It was a residential foreclosure notice, stamped with a massive red warning seal. Vivian let out a strangled, horrified gasp, grabbing her son's arm. She recognized the document immediately. To Vivian, the sprawling Buckhead mansion was her entire identity. It was her crown jewel, the physical proof of her elite breeding. The Sterling family estate, located in the most exclusive neighborhood in Buckhead, is currently carrying 3 separate mortgages, I announced, watching Vivian's face turn the color of wet ash. The 3rd mortgage was taken out just 6 months ago at a predatory interest rate of 19%, simply to keep the lights on and pay the landscaping staff. According to this notice of default, the bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday. By the end of this month, the Sterling family will be officially evicted from their historic home. The wealthy socialites in the crowd began whispering furiously to one another. The absolute shame of losing a home to the bank was the ultimate taboo in their circle. Vivian tried to cover her face with her silk shawl completely, unable to meet the judging eyes of the women she had spent decades looking down upon, and the luxury vehicles parked at the valet stand right outside. I continued swiping to the next slide, showing an aggressive collection agency notice. The matching Mercedes-Benz SUVs that Julian and Vivian love to parade around town are not owned. They are leased through a third-party subprime agency, and they are currently 90 days past due for immediate repossession. The only reason the tow trucks have not arrived at this country club tonight to haul those cars away is because I personally paid a courtesy extension fee last month, just so we could attend this gala without a public scene. Julian was staring at the floor, entirely defeated. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His lies were mathematically dismantled and projected in 40-foot high-definition letters for the entire city to see. But I had one final document to show them, one final piece of leverage that would ensure the Sterling family could never again show their faces in polite society. I swiped the screen one last time, bringing up a simple itemized bank ledger from my own personal checking account. And finally, we come to the very ground we are standing on tonight, I said, looking directly at the country club general manager, who was standing near the back doors, looking completely stunned. Vivian loves to boast about her platinum status at this elite establishment. She loves to remind everyone that her family has been attending these exclusive events for 3 generations. I pointed the digital laser at the recurring monthly charges highlighted in bright yellow. But what Vivian conveniently forgot to mention to all of you is that the Sterling Family Trust ran out of money 2 years ago. I stated, my voice echoing with cold, absolute finality. For the last 24 months, the prestigious Sterling Platinum membership, the country club dues, the private golf lessons, the expensive spa treatments, and the lavish dinners have been paid for entirely by me. Every single time Vivian walked through those front doors, she did it on my dime. The room erupted into absolute pandemonium. The sheer humiliation of a matriarch relying on the daughter-in-law she openly despised to fund her country club lifestyle was the ultimate fatal blow to her social standing. Vivian collapsed into a nearby chair, clutching her chest, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Julian stood completely paralyzed, surrounded by furious investors demanding their money back. I stood on the stage, looking down at the absolute destruction I had just orchestrated. I had walked them through the numbers with cold auditor precision and left them with absolutely nothing. But the night was not over yet. Because the true owner of their $40 million debt had just arrived and she was ready to make her entrance. The massive digital displays glowed with undeniable proof, casting a harsh light over the ruined family. The sheer weight of the truth finally crushed the last remaining fragments of Vivian's fabricated reality. She could no longer rely on her haughty sneers or condescending remarks. The entire foundation of her existence was projected on the wall behind me in red ink and foreclosure stamps. "Those documents are completely forged!" Vivian suddenly screamed, her voice tearing through the silent ballroom like a jagged piece of glass. She lunged forward, pushing past a stunned city councilman, her face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate hysteria. She pointed a trembling finger at the screens, and then directly at me. "She hacked into our accounts. She manufactured those statements to make us look bad. She is a jealous, spiteful girl from the South Side, and she is trying to destroy a legacy she could never truly be a part of. Do not look at those screens. It is all a malicious lie." The wealthy investors and socialites surrounding her did not offer their usual sympathetic murmurs. They simply stared at her with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. In the cutthroat world of Atlanta, high society running out of money was a sin, but getting caught running a massive fraudulent scheme was an absolute death sentence. Terrence finally realized that standing in the back of the room looking sick was not going to save him from federal prison. As the family lawyer who had personally signed off on dozens of those fraudulent wire transfers, he knew that every second those documents remained on the screens was another nail in his legal coffin. He broke away from the wall and sprinted down the side aisle of the ballroom, heading straight for the audiovisual control booth located just to the right of the main stage. He moved frantically, his tailored suit jacket flapping open wildly as he tried to reach the massive tangle of cables connecting the projector to the main system. "Shut it down!" Terrence yelled at the terrified audio technician who was cowering behind the mixing board. "Pull the plug right now!" Terrence reached out to physically rip the heavy black power cords from the wall socket, but he never even laid a finger on them. One of the massive security guards from my private detail had anticipated the move perfectly. The bodyguard stepped smoothly in front of the AV booth, planting his feet shoulder-width apart, and simply crossed his arms. Terrence, moving with too much reckless momentum, slammed directly into the guard. It was like watching a small bird fly full speed into a solid brick window. Terrence bounced off the massive man, stumbling backward and landing hard on his hands and knees. "Do not touch the equipment, sir," the bodyguard warned, his voice a deep rumbling threat that required absolutely no shouting to be terrifyingly clear. Julian, seeing his brother completely neutralized and his mother breaking down into a hysterical mess, finally snapped. He lost every single ounce of the polished corporate charm he had spent years perfecting. He stormed down the center aisle, moving with a blind, violent rage. He shoved a wealthy real estate developer out of his way without a second thought, his eyes locked entirely on me. "I will sue you into absolute oblivion!" Julian roared, charging toward the stage. He hit the bottom of the carpeted steps, intending to rush the podium and physically drag me away from the microphone. But David, the head of security, moved with lightning speed. David stepped directly onto the center of the stairs, blocking the path completely. When Julian tried to push past him, David placed a massive hand flat against Julian's chest and shoved him backward with enough force to send him stumbling into the front row of empty chairs. "You are going to prison for this, Camille!" Julian screamed, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "You are committing corporate espionage. You are violating non-disclosure agreements. I will bury you in so much litigation you will never see the light of day. I will completely destroy your life. I will take every single penny you have ever earned. I stood at the acrylic podium perfectly still. I did not flinch when he rushed the stage. I did not react to his violent threats. I simply looked down at him, watching a man who had built his entire life on intimidation completely unravel when his primary weapon no longer worked. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the podium, bringing my face close to the iPad microphone. "You are going to take my pennies, Julian?" I asked, my voice echoing through the massive speakers, with a cold, calculated calmness that completely neutralized his screaming. "With what money exactly? Are you going to pay your high-powered lawyers with the negative $400,000 in your operating account? Or maybe you can pay them with the equity in your house, assuming the bank does not change the locks on your front doors by Tuesday morning." The crowd let out a low, collective murmur. The absolute logic of my statement was undeniable. You cannot sue someone into oblivion when you cannot even afford to keep the lights on in your own home. Julian gripped the back of a velvet chair, his knuckles turning stark white. "You do not know everything," he hissed desperately, trying to salvage some shred of his shattered authority. "You think you have me cornered, but you only see a fraction of the business. You do not understand high-level corporate restructuring. The Sterling Group is backed by some of the most powerful financial entities in this state." I let out a soft, sharp laugh that carried perfectly through the audio feed. I looked directly into his panicked eyes, completely ready to spring the final trap. "If you are so rich, Julian," I began, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the ballroom. "If the Sterling Group is such a powerful historical powerhouse, then tell everyone in this room who holds the mortgage on this very country club. Tell them who bought out your $40 million commercial debt when absolutely every single bank in the state of Georgia rejected your loan applications last year. Tell them the name of the savior who is currently keeping you out of a federal penitentiary." Julian puffed out his chest. For a brief, fleeting second, the arrogant, narcissistic chief executive officer returned. He genuinely believed I had just handed him a lifeline. He thought I was questioning his connections, and he was more than ready to prove that he had powerful, wealthy allies who would crush a Southside auditor like me without a second thought. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders to the crowd. "Vanguard Apex Holdings," Julian proudly shouted to the entire room, his voice echoing loudly. "A massive private equity firm that actually believes in our vision. They bought our debt because they know exactly how valuable the Sterling name is. They are fully backing our next project, and when that deal closes, your little stock options will look like absolute pocket change, you stupid bitch." He hurled the insult with explosive venom, entirely confident that Vanguard Apex was his ultimate impenetrable shield. The wealthy crowd visibly cringed at his foul language on the live microphone. Any lingering sympathy the investors might have had for a man whose wife was airing his dirty laundry completely evaporated the second he called me a bitch in front of the mayor. I did not react to the insult. I did not need to. I simply stood up perfectly straight and offered Julian a slow, knowing smile. It was the smile of a chess player who had just announced checkmate 3 moves before their opponent even realized the game was over. Right on cue, the heavy, solid oak doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung open with a massive, resounding thud. The sound was so loud and so perfectly timed that nearly all 300 guests whipped their heads around simultaneously to look at the entrance. The collective gasp that swept through the room was louder than the one that followed Julian's slap. The sea of elite socialites, local politicians, and wealthy bank executives instinctively parted down the center aisle, creating a wide, clear runway from the entrance all the way to the stage. Through the open doors stepped a woman who commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the building simply by existing. It was Renee, my mother. For 5 years, Vivian and Julian had openly mocked her. They had called her a retired public school clerk. They had made jokes about her living in the hood. They had assumed that because she did not flaunt her wealth with tacky designer logos or loud leased vehicles, she must be entirely destitute. But the woman walking down the center aisle of the country club did not look like a retired school clerk. She looked like an absolute titan of industry. My mother was wearing a custom-tailored $10,000 Tom Ford suit in a deep, striking charcoal gray. The cut was immaculate, radiating cold corporate power. Her hair was styled perfectly, and a single elegant diamond tennis necklace rested against her collarbone, catching the emergency red lighting and reflecting it back like sharp little knives. She did not walk with a hurried, anxious pace. She walked with the slow, deliberate glide of a billionaire who owned the very floor she was stepping on. She was not alone. Flanking her on either side were four top-tier corporate lawyers from one of the most ruthless litigation firms on the East Coast. They wore identical dark suits and carried heavy leather briefcases, moving in perfect synchronization with my mother, like a pack of wolves guarding their alpha. The silence in the ballroom reached a deafening absolute peak. You could hear the sharp, authoritative click of my mother's heels against the polished hardwood floor echoing through the massive space. The wealthy elite of Atlanta did not know her face, but they recognized the unmistakable aura of true, quiet wealth. They recognized the expensive cut of the suit, the posture of absolute dominance, and the terrifying presence of a legal team that looked ready to dismantle a corporation before breakfast. Vivian, who had been sobbing into her shawl, slowly lowered her hands. She stared at the woman walking down the aisle, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute confusion. She squinted, trying to process the impossible image in front of her. Julian turned around to his arrogant smile, completely freezing on his face. He looked at the imposing woman in the Tom Ford suit, and then he looked up at me standing on the stage. His brain simply could not connect the dots. He could not understand why my mother was walking into his exclusive country club looking like a Fortune 500 chief executive officer. My mother reached the front of the stage, stopping exactly 10 feet away from Julian. Her four lawyers stopped immediately behind her, standing at attention. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Vivian. She fixed her cold, dark eyes entirely on Julian. She reached out her hand, and one of the lawyers immediately opened his leather briefcase, pulling out a single thick manila folder. He placed it securely into her waiting hand. My mother held the folder up, looking at Julian with an expression of pure icy calculation. The trap was fully sprung, and the Sterling family legacy was about to be officially erased. The heavy manila folder in my mother's hand seemed to absorb every single ounce of light in the room. She stood at the base of the stage, looking up at Julian with a gaze so intensely cold it could have frozen the entire city of Atlanta. The four corporate lawyers fanned out slightly behind her, standing with their hands clasped in front of them. They looked like an execution squad waiting for the final order to drop the blade. Vivian was still clutching her emerald silk shawl, but her hands were trembling so violently that the fabric shook against her collarbone. She stared at my mother, and I could physically see her mind completely fracturing as it tried to process the impossible image standing before her. For 5 entire years, Vivian had aggressively pushed the narrative that my mother was a pitiful, destitute woman. She had told her country club friends that Renee was a retired public school clerk who clipped coupons and shopped at discount grocery stores. Vivian had built an entire psychological fortress around the idea that she was the absolute pinnacle of high society, while my mother was nothing more than the dirt beneath her expensive shoes. But the woman standing before her was not wearing discount clothing. She was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that cost more than the lease on Vivian's imported vehicle. She was not shrinking back in the presence of the wealthy elite. She was commanding the room with an effortless, terrifying authority that Vivian had spent her entire life trying to fake. The sheer reality of my mother's wealth and power crashed down on Vivian like a concrete wall. Her knees visibly buckled, and she had to reach out and grab the back of a nearby velvet chair just to keep herself from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. Julian was completely paralyzed. His arrogant chest, which had been puffed out in triumph just moments ago, was now completely deflated. He looked from the massive digital screens projecting his financial ruin down to the imposing woman standing at the edge of the stage. His brain simply refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. He took a hesitant step forward, raising his hand to point a shaking finger at my mother. "What are you doing here?" Julian demanded, his voice lacking all of its previous booming authority. It sounded thin and reedy, like a frightened child. "How did you get past the security detail at the front gate? You are not a member of this club. You do not belong here. He turned his attention to the four corporate lawyers, desperately hoping that they were the actual authority figures in the room. He assumed my mother was just a crazy woman who had somehow wandered in to cause a scene. "Gentlemen," Julian said, forcing a pathetic fake smile onto his face. "I do not know what kind of legal stunt my ex-wife is trying to pull, but you need to remove her mother from this building immediately. This is a private event for high-net-worth investors." The lead lawyer, a tall man with silver hair and a sharp jawline, did not even blink. He did not look at Julian. He simply kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, entirely focused on protecting his billionaire client. "We answer exclusively to the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Apex Holdings," the lawyer stated, his voice echoing clearly through the silent ballroom. "And she is standing right in front of you." The words hung in the air, suspended in the thick, suffocating tension of the room. The wealthy investors standing nearby gasped, taking collective steps backward. They looked at my mother with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. Julian shook his head, a nervous, panicked laugh escaping his throat. "No," he stammered, taking another step back. "No, that is completely impossible. Vanguard Apex is a massive private equity firm based in New York. I have spoken to their representatives on the phone. I have seen their corporate letterhead. They are a multi-billion-dollar entity. You are just a public school clerk. You live in a small house on the South Side. This is a trick." My mother did not raise her voice. She did not scream or throw a tantrum the way Vivian and Julian did when they felt threatened. She simply took one step closer to him, her designer heels clicking ominously against the polished floor. "You really should have paid more attention to the corporate structuring when you signed those loan agreements, Julian," my mother said, her voice perfectly calm and devastatingly precise. "But you were too busy bragging about the size of your loan to actually read the fine print. You were so desperate for a financial lifeline that you blindly accepted $40 million from a firm you knew absolutely nothing about." She slowly raised the thick manila folder, holding it up so the harsh red emergency lighting illuminated the Vanguard Apex Holdings logo, embossed on the front cover. "Actually, Julian," my mother continued, her words falling like heavy stones into a completely still pond, "Vanguard Apex Holdings is just one of my shell companies. I own your debt." The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like the entire world had stopped turning. Julian stopped breathing. His eyes widened to an impossible size, staring at the folder in my mother's hand, as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. The absolute magnitude of his mistake finally crushed whatever was left of his massive ego. For the past year, Julian had genuinely believed he was a brilliant businessman. He thought he had outsmarted the market by securing a massive private equity loan, when every single traditional bank in the state of Georgia had laughed him out of their offices. He thought Vanguard Apex believed in his vision. He thought they respected the historic Sterling family name. He had strutted around Atlanta bragging about his powerful New York investors using their money to pay his country club dues and keep his leased luxury cars in the driveway. He never once suspected that the invisible billionaire funding his entire fraudulent lifestyle was the very woman he had banned from attending his Thanksgiving dinners. He never once realized that while he was busy mocking my mother for her modest suburban home, she was sitting in a high-rise boardroom buying up the massive toxic debt he was desperately trying to hide. Vivian let out a low, agonizing moan. She covered her face with both hands, completely unable to bear the absolute humiliation. The elite socialites who had previously worshipped her were now actively whispering and pointing. They were watching the mighty Sterling matriarch realize that her entire existence was entirely owned by the black woman from the South Side she had relentlessly terrorized for 5 years. "You set me up," Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of horror and betrayal. He looked up at me standing on the stage and then back down at my mother. "You planned this. You deliberately bought my loans just so you could destroy me tonight." "I did not set you up, Julian," my mother replied, her tone devoid of any sympathy. "You set yourself up. You built a fake empire on a foundation of lies and stolen money. I simply purchased the paper that proved it. You came to my company begging for $40 million because your own mother remortgaged this family into absolute oblivion. I approved the loan because Camille asked me to give you one final chance to prove you were a real man. My mother took another step forward, closing the distance until she was standing just a few feet away from his trembling frame. She looked him up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. I gave you the capital to save your family, my mother said, her voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. I gave you the opportunity to build something real. All you had to do was treat my daughter with the basic human respect she deserved. But you could not even manage that. You took my money, you fed your own disgusting narcissism, and then you had the absolute audacity to lay your hands on my child. Julian swallowed hard, taking a frantic step backward. He looked wildly around the room, searching for anyone who might help him. He looked at Terrence, who was still cowering near the audio booth, refusing to make eye contact. He looked at the bank executives who had already turned their backs on him, mentally erasing his phone number from their contacts. He had absolutely no one left. The post-nuptial agreement you forced my daughter to sign tonight was your final fatal mistake. My mother continued, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors of the VIP room down the hall. You aggressively demanded a total separation of assets. You wanted to make sure she could not touch your imaginary fortune. But all you did was legally protect her $15 million from the massive financial slaughter that is about to happen to you. My mother snapped her fingers, a sharp, echoing sound that made Julian physically jump. The silver-haired lawyer immediately stepped forward, opening his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper and stamped with bright red official court seals. My mother looked at Julian with cold, absolute finality. The chance I gave you expired the exact second your hand touched my daughter's face. My mother turned her piercing gaze away from Julian and slowly shifted her attention to the woman trembling beside him. Vivian looked as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly turned to quicksand. She was clutching her emerald silk shawl so tightly, her knuckles were completely white, but no amount of expensive fabric could protect her from the absolute reckoning standing right in front of her. My mother walked toward Vivian with the slow, measured grace of a predator that had already won the hunt. The wealthy guests who had previously crowded around the matriarch quickly took several large steps backward, completely abandoning Vivian to face her fate entirely alone. Even in her state of sheer panic, Vivian instinctively tried to straighten her posture, attempting to summon whatever tiny shred of high society dignity she had left. But it was entirely useless. Standing face to face with the true owner of her existence, Vivian looked remarkably small, fragile, and entirely pathetic. You called my daughter a charity case, my mother said, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. You sat at your lavish dinner tables and you laughed with your country club friends about the poor little girl from the South Side who had somehow infiltrated your pristine bloodline. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of desperate apology or pathetic justification, but the words completely died in her throat. She could only stare in wide-eyed terror at the $10,000 custom suit and the flawless diamond necklace resting against my mother's skin. You thought that because I did not wear my wealth on my sleeve, that we were somehow beneath you. My mother continued, her tone completely devoid of any anger. She spoke with the cold clinical precision of a judge reading a guilty verdict. You thought that because I did not waste my money on leased luxury vehicles or massive mortgages to impress people who do not actually care about me, that I must be destitute. You judged my entire worth based on my zip code and your own deep-seated financial insecurities. My mother took one final step closer, leaning in slightly. The sheer physical intimidation of her presence made Vivian visibly shrink backward. I could have crushed your family 3 years ago. My mother stated, her words echoing through the live audio feed for the entire city of Atlanta to hear. When your son's fraudulent loan applications landed on my desk, I could have easily let the banks foreclose on you and watched you lose everything. But I did not. I bought your toxic debt specifically because Camille asked me to give her husband a fair chance. She loved him, and she wanted to believe that with enough financial breathing room, he could turn this disastrous family business around. Julian let out a ragged, desperate breath, staring at the floor. He finally realized the absolute magnitude of the grace I had quietly extended to him and how spectacularly he had squandered it. "I gave him that chance," my mother said, her voice hardening into pure, solid steel. "I stayed completely in the shadows, and I allowed you to keep playing your little games of high society royalty. But that chance officially expired the exact second your hand touched my daughter's face tonight." My mother did not wait for Vivian to respond. She simply straightened her posture and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the four silver-haired corporate lawyers standing rigidly behind her. The execution was swift, brutal, and perfectly synchronized. The lead lawyer stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of legally binding documents from his heavy leather briefcase. He walked directly up to Julian and forcefully pressed the papers against my husband's chest, forcing Julian to instinctively grab them before they fell to the floor. "Julian Sterling, you are officially served," the lawyer announced, his voice ringing out with absolute professional authority. "Notice of immediate default on the Vanguard Apex Holdings commercial loan. Notice of immediate asset seizure for all properties held under the Sterling Group umbrella." A second lawyer moved smoothly toward Vivian, pulling an identical thick stack of papers from his own briefcase. He did not hand them to her gently. He thrust them directly into her trembling hands. "Vivian Sterling, you are officially served," the second lawyer stated. "Notice of immediate residential foreclosure on the Buckhead estate. Notice of immediate debt collection for all outstanding personal liabilities held by Vanguard Apex Holdings." The third lawyer marched over to Terrence, who was still cowering near the audio booth, trying to physically blend into the shadows. The lawyer slapped the legal documents squarely into Terrence's chest. Terrence let out a pathetic whimper, clutching the papers as if they were literally burning his hands. "Terrence Sterling, you are officially served," the third lawyer declared loudly. "Notice of immediate default and formal notification of pending litigation regarding fraudulent corporate wire transfers." The sheer public humiliation of the moment was absolutely unprecedented. In the elite circles of Atlanta, being served with legal papers was a nightmare, usually reserved for quiet private offices behind closed doors. To be served with massive foreclosure and asset seizure notices right on the main floor of the most exclusive country club in the city, in front of the mayor, the city council, and 300 wealthy investors, was an absolute social execution. The Sterling family was not just financially ruined, they were permanently, publicly obliterated. Julian stared down at the thick stack of papers in his hands, his eyes darting frantically across the bold red stamps and the undeniable legal jargon. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death certificate. He finally understood that there were no loopholes. There were no aggressive counter-lawsuits he could threaten. My mother had him completely boxed in, and the post-nuptial agreement he had forced me to sign just minutes earlier had permanently sealed all the exits. While Julian and Vivian were completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of their new reality, someone else in the room was rapidly calculating her own odds of survival. Harper had been standing near the side exit, her back pressed tightly against the wall. For the past 20 minutes, she had watched the massive digital screens expose the absolute zero balance of the Sterling family bank accounts. She had watched the powerful bank executives turn their backs in disgust. And now she was watching a team of ruthless corporate lawyers hand out immediate foreclosure notices to her husband and her mother-in-law. The illusion of the mighty Sterling fortune was completely dead. And with it, the sweet, innocent Southern belle facade that Harper had worn for years instantly evaporated. Harper was a woman who required absolute financial security, and she had married Terrence exclusively because she believed he provided it. She had tolerated Vivian's overbearing nature and Julian's massive ego because she thought the payoff was guaranteed. Realizing that she had tied her life to a sinking ship filled with broke frauds triggered a survival instinct that was entirely devoid of any loyalty or love. Harper pushed herself off the wall, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. She marched aggressively across the edge of the ballroom, heading straight for Terrence. Her delicate porcelain doll act was completely gone, replaced by the harsh, shrill fury of a woman who had just been robbed. "You absolute pathetic loser!" Harper screamed, her voice piercing through the stunned silence of the crowd. Terrence flinched violently, clutching his legal documents to his chest. He looked up at his wife, his eyes wide with desperate pleading. "Harper, please," he begged, taking a step toward her. "Do not do this right now, not in front of everyone. We can figure this out. I can call my contacts. We can fix it." "Fix it!" Harper shrieked, laughing a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like scraping metal. "You cannot fix anything, Terrence. You are completely broke. You have been completely broke this entire time, and you lied to my face. You promised me a massive trust fund. You promised me the estate in Buckhead. And now I find out you are nothing but a massive criminal running a fake company with your stupid brother." "Harper, keep your voice down," Terrence hissed desperately, looking around at the wealthy socialites who were eagerly watching the dramatic implosion of their marriage. "You are embarrassing the family. I do not care about this pathetic fake family," Harper yelled back, pointing a vicious finger directly at his face. "I am not going down with a bunch of broke frauds. Do you hear me, Terrence? I am absolutely done. I am going back to the house right now to pack my bags. I am taking the kids and I am driving straight to my parents' estate. My lawyers will contact you in the morning, assuming you can even afford to answer the phone." Terrence completely snapped. The stress of the federal fraud charges, the public humiliation, and the sudden vicious betrayal of the wife he had always idolized finally broke his cowardly restraint. "Your parents' estate!" Terrence shouted back, his face turning a dark, angry red. "Do not stand there and act like you are some innocent victim, Harper. You knew exactly how much money you were spending. You burned through $80,000 on a completely useless kitchen renovation just last month. You knew my credit cards were bouncing, but you just kept buying your stupid designer pearls. Your parents are just as broke as we are, and you know it." The crowd watched in absolute twisted fascination as the golden couple of Atlanta high society tore each other apart like wild animals fighting over scraps. Harper lunged forward, actually shoving Terrence hard in the chest. Terrence shouted a string of vicious curses, entirely forgetting the polite, aristocratic manners he had spent his entire life pretending to possess. They were screaming right in each other's faces, airing every single dirty secret, every financial lie, and every bitter resentment they had harbored for years. While her two sons completely melted down in the center of the room, Vivian finally reached her absolute physical and mental breaking point. The woman who had built her entire identity on control, respect, and the perception of flawless superiority could no longer carry the weight of her total destruction. She looked at Julian, who was staring blankly at his legal papers, completely catatonic. She looked at Terrence, who was engaged in a trashy screaming match with the daughter-in-law she had always fiercely protected. She looked up at the massive LED screens broadcasting her foreclosure notices to the entire city. Vivian let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hands flew up to clutch her chest right over her heart. Her face turned a sickly pale gray. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the thick carpet. She collapsed heavily into one of the velvet dining chairs, her head falling back as she gasped desperately for air. It was a severe panic attack brought on by the absolute crushing weight of total undeniable ruin. She wheezed, reaching a trembling hand out toward her eldest son. "Julian," she gasped, her voice weak and pathetic. "Julian, please help me." But Julian did not even turn his head. He was completely consumed by the paperwork in his hands, staring at the bold red Vanguard Apex logo that represented his absolute destruction. Vivian turned her head toward her youngest son. "Terrence," she cried out, tears finally streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Terrence, I cannot breathe." Terrence completely ignored her, raising his voice even louder to scream over Harper's vicious insults. The mighty matriarch of the Sterling family was entirely abandoned. The sons she had worshipped, the sons she had taught to prioritize money and image above human decency and loyalty, were now entirely too obsessed with their own financial ruin to even notice that their mother was physically collapsing right behind them. She sat slouched in the velvet chair, gasping for air, surrounded by 300 people she had desperately tried to impress, and not a single one of them stepped forward to help her. I stood on the stage next to my mother, watching the absolute carnage unfold. We did not smile. We did not gloat. We simply watched the natural, inevitable consequence of a family that had built their entire foundation on cruelty and lies. When you build a house entirely out of toxic rot, you do not need to push very hard to make it fall. You simply have to turn on the lights and let the structure collapse under its own miserable weight. The absolute reality of his situation finally severed the strings holding Julian up. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed, dropping heavily onto his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor of the grand ballroom. The thick stack of legal documents slipped from his trembling hands and scattered across the carpeted steps of the stage, spreading out like a fan of terrible omens. The loud, authoritative chief executive officer, who had slapped my face just an hour ago, was entirely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man, kneeling in the center of his own destruction. He looked up at me, and the arrogant mask completely shattered. Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling over his eyelashes and streaming down his face. He crawled forward on his knees, ignoring the horrified gasps of the wealthy socialites who were watching the mighty sterling heir degrade himself in public. He reached out, grabbing the hem of my custom gown with trembling, desperate hands. "Camille, please!" He begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic sob. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to talk to your mother. Tell her to give me more time. I can fix this. I swear to God, I can fix this." I looked down at his hands clutching my dress. I did not step back, but I did not reach out to comfort him either. I simply stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clinical detachment. "I did not want to do any of this," Julian sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. The pressure of running this family business was completely destroying me. You have no idea what it is like to carry the weight of the Sterling legacy. My mother was constantly demanding more money. The banks were closing in on every side. I was drowning, Camille. I was completely drowning, and Vanguard Apex was the only lifeline I had left. I only hit you because the stress was driving me insane. I lost control, but I never meant to hurt you. I love you, Camille. You are my wife. We are supposed to be a team. Please give me a second chance." His apologies were exactly like his business ledgers. They were completely fraudulent. He was not apologizing because he felt genuine remorse for physically assaulting his wife in front of 300 people. He was apologizing because his bank accounts were empty and he wanted me to save him from federal prison. He was still trying to blame his mother, blame the economy, and blame the stress of his fake legacy for his own violent, abusive actions. I reached into my small black designer clutch. When I had signed that post-nuptial agreement in the VIP room, I had made sure to take the legally binding carbon duplicate for my own records, folding it neatly and slipping it away while they were busy celebrating their false victory. I pulled the folded document out, now smoothing it flat with my hands. I looked down at Julian, who was still weeping at my feet. "You do not want a team, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying clearly over the microphone for the entire room to hear. "You wanted a hostage. You wanted an ATM you could abuse whenever you felt insecure about your own massive failures. You stood in that VIP room, and you forced me to sign this document because you wanted to completely destroy me." I held the signed post-nuptial agreement up high, so the bright red emergency lights illuminated my signature on the bottom line. "You insisted that we separate our assets tonight." I continued reading his absolute doom into the official record. "You demanded that all properties and financial holdings acquired by either party remain strictly isolated. You made sure to include an ironclad clause that neither party shall be held liable for the debts of the other. You looked me in the eye, and you told me you were protecting your multi-million-dollar empire from a Southside gold digger." Julian stared at the document, his tear-streaked face twisting in fresh confusion. He still could not fully grasp how his own weapon was being used to execute him. "But you never bothered to look at my actual accounts, Julian," I said, allowing a sharp, cold smile to finally break across my face. "You assumed that because I did not brag about my salary, I had nothing to hide. You assumed that because I am a black woman who grew up without a trust fund, my net worth was entirely insignificant compared to yours. But my auditing firm went public last month. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his. Which means the $15 million I made in private stock options this year is legally and entirely mine. I whispered the words, cutting through him like a surgical scalpel. It is locked completely out of your reach by the very contract you forced me to sign. And the $40 million in toxic commercial debt that my mother just officially called in is legally and entirely yours. You built your own cage, Julian. You locked the door, and you handed me the only key. You played yourself. Julian let out a raw, agonizing scream. It was not a scream of anger. It was the sound of a man watching his entire soul get ripped out of his body. He buried his face in his hands, collapsing completely onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably into the scattered legal documents that dictated his total ruin. I did not stay to watch him cry. I had delivered the final blow and the audit was officially closed. I stood up straight and turned to my mother. She looked at me, her dark eyes shining with a deep, quiet pride. She did not need to say a single word. We had executed the plan flawlessly. We had walked into a fortress of arrogance and dismantled it completely from the inside out. My mother gave a brief nod to her 4 corporate lawyers. They immediately stepped back, turning on their heels with military precision. David, the head of security, tapped his earpiece and signaled the rest of his team. The massive bodyguards instantly formed a tight protective diamond around us. We turned our backs on the screaming, ruined family. We began our walk down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, heading toward the heavy oak exit doors. The 300 elite guests of Atlanta high society parted for us like the Red Sea. Nobody whispered. Nobody pointed. They simply lowered their eyes in absolute terrified respect as we passed. We walked past Vivian, who was still slumped in her velvet chair, completely catatonic, staring blankly at the ceiling, while the paramedics she desperately needed were nowhere to be found. We walked past Terrence, who was sitting on the floor, with his head between his knees, entirely broken by his wife's vicious public abandonment. As we neared the exit doors, I could hear Julian finally finding his voice again. He scrambled to his feet, screaming frantically across the ballroom. "Where are my lawyers?" Julian shouted, his voice echoing with absolute desperate panic. "Somebody call my legal team. I need representation right now." I glanced over my shoulder one last time. I watched the prominent investment bankers and the elite corporate attorneys who had been drinking his expensive scotch all night, actively turning their backs on him. They were rushing toward the side exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Sterling Group Ponzi scheme. Julian was completely alone, shouting into a room full of people who had already entirely erased him from their world. David pushed the heavy wooden doors open and we stepped out of the country club. The transition was immediate and beautiful. We left the chaotic, suffocating blood-red glare of the ballroom and stepped out into the peaceful, warm Atlanta night. The air smelled of sweet jasmine and fresh rain. The soft chirping of crickets completely replaced the frantic screaming we had left behind. The valet immediately brought my mother's sleek black town car around, the engine purring quietly in the circular driveway. I stood on the paved driveway, taking a deep lungful of the warm night air. The dull ache in my left cheek where Julian had struck me was still there, but it no longer felt like a mark of humiliation. It felt like a battle scar from a war I had definitively won. I had spent 5 years shrinking myself to fit into a family that despised me. I had spent 5 years believing that if I just worked harder, gave more money, and stayed quiet enough, I would eventually earn their respect. But standing there under the clear Georgia sky, I finally understood the truth. They say marriage is about building a legacy. They tell us that we are supposed to merge our lives, our finances, and our histories to create a powerful foundation for the future. I tried to build a legacy with a man who only wanted to use my bricks to build a monument to himself. But as I looked at my mother standing confidently beside her luxury car, I realized that my true legacy had nothing to do with the Sterling family name. My true legacy was not found in country club memberships, leased luxury SUVs, or heavily mortgaged mansions in Buckhead. My true legacy was the quiet, untouchable strength my mother had passed down to me. It was the absolute, unshakable knowledge of my own worth It was the ability to stand in a room full of people who wanted to see me break and calmly calculate their absolute ruin instead. My mother taught me that true power does not need to scream or wear expensive designer labels to be felt. True power is walking away with everything, while the people who tried to destroy you are left fighting over the ashes of their own lies. Have you ever realized that the people trying to make you feel small are actually terrified of the immense power you hold? The ones who criticize your background, mock your career, and demand your absolute submission are usually the ones who are drowning in their own massive insecurities. They attack you because your light exposes the deep, miserable cracks in their own fake foundations. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family, a narcissistic partner, or a situation designed to keep you trapped and diminished, I want to hear from you. Tell me your story of breaking free in the comments below. Let this space be a testament to the fact that we do not have to accept the terrible roles they try to force us into. And remember, as you navigate your own battles, never mistake a woman's silence for weakness. She might not be crying, she might not be giving up, she might just be doing the math, checking the receipts, and quietly calculating your absolute financial and social ruin. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that deep, satisfying thrill of watching a bully finally get exactly what they deserve, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Join the community and keep coming back for more stories of resilience, truth, and the beautiful art of taking your power back. Until next time, stay strong, stay brilliant, and never let anyone convince you to pay the debts they created.